Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been a brush picker for almost 15 years now. For those who don't know what that means, I harvest things like maple vine, salal, huckleberry, and other forest products that get sold to florists and nurseries. It's not glamorous work, but it pays decent money if you know the right spots and can put in the hours. Most days are pretty quiet. Just me, my clippers, and miles of forest. At least they were until last summer. This happened in late August in the National Forest, about 30 miles east of Forks, Washington. I was working a remote area off an old logging road that hadn't seen traffic in years. My boss had dropped 4 of us off at different spots that morning, planning to pick us up before sunset. The area looked promising, lots of vine maple in the understory, which is exactly what I was after that day. The morning went by like any other. I'd been working since around 7, moving slowly through the forest, filling my collection bags. It was warm but not hot, perfect weather for being in the woods. By around 1 in the afternoon, I'd worked my way about a mile down an old skid road, cutting good quality vines and feeling pretty satisfied with my haul. I remember checking my watch and thinking about taking a lunch break when I heard something that made me freeze. It sounded like something big, moving through the brush maybe 100 yards up the hill to my right. Not just walking, but tearing through it. There was this weird mix of sounds. A deep, rumbling growl, followed by high-pitched squeals that didn't sound like any animal I recognized. And I've heard pretty much everything in these woods over the years. At first, I thought maybe it was a bear with cubs, or possibly a cougar taking down an elk. Whatever it was making a hell of a racket. The sensible part of my brain was saying, just keep working and mind your own business. But 15 years in the woods makes you curious about these things. I'd never heard anything quite like it before. I set down my collection bags and gear as quietly as I could and started making my way uphill toward the sounds. I moved slowly, careful not to snap branches or rustle leaves. The noise was getting louder, and I could tell I was getting close. There was definitely something big up there, and it was agitated about something. I came to a small rise covered with ferns and salmonberry bushes. The sounds were just on the other side. I got down low and crawled the last few feet, pushing aside some ferns to peer over the top. What I saw first didn't make sense to my brain. About 30 yards away, there was what looked like a black bear draped over a bent vine maple. It wasn't moving. Below this, partially obscured by brush, was something else, something much bigger. It took my eyes a few seconds to process what I was seeing. It was standing upright, facing away from me. My first thought was, that's not a bear, because bears don't stand like that, not for that long. This thing was huge, at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It had these massive shoulders, wider than any human I've ever seen, and arms that hung down almost to its knees. The whole thing was covered in dark brown hair, not fur exactly, but more like matted hair, longer in some spots, especially around the shoulders. From my position, I could see it was doing something with its hands, manipulating something on the ground that I couldn't make out clearly because of the brush. I lay there, completely still, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. My mind was racing through possibilities. A bear, standing weird. Some guy in a ghillie suit. But deep down I already knew it wasn't either of those things. This was something else entirely. Then it happened. The creature suddenly straightened up, going completely still like it had sensed something. Then it spun around, not like a person turns, but with this fluid, unnaturally fast movement. And it saw me. I'll never forget those eyes as long as I live. They were red, not just brown or amber, like an animal's eyes can sometimes look in certain light. but burning red, like hot coals. They seemed to glow even in the daylight. Its face was almost hidden in the matted hair, but those eyes cut right through it, locked directly on mine. For what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was like every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I was completely frozen. Its mouth opened slightly, showing teeth that looked too big for any normal animal. There was blood around its mouth and down its chest. That's when I noticed something else. It had a long gash down its back, fresh and bleeding. Whatever this thing was, it was injured. The moment broke when it made this sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a scream, but something in between that made my skin crawl. That's when my body finally caught up with my brain, and I scrambled backwards, losing my footing and tumbling partway down the hill. I don't remember consciously deciding to run. One moment I was falling, the next I was sprinting downhill as fast as I could, branches and thorns tearing at my face and arms. I didn't look back. I didn't stop to grab my gear. I just ran. I have no idea how long I ran for, or even if that thing chased me. All I know is I eventually found myself back at the skid road, lungs burning, legs shaking, blood running down my arms from dozens of scratches. I kept going until I reached our meeting point, where one of the other pickers was already waiting. He took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I was covered in sweat, bleeding, and probably white as a sheet. When he asked what happened, I couldn't even form words at first. I just kept looking back up the hill, expecting that thing to come bursting out of the tree line. When our boss showed up with the truck about an hour later, I finally managed to tell them what I'd seen. I expected them to laugh or think I was crazy, but my boss just got real quiet. He asked a few questions about exactly where I'd been, then made a decision that surprised me. We were packing up and leaving, not just me, but all of us, even though we'd planned to work until sunset. Nobody argued. We loaded up quickly and were on the road within 20 minutes. It wasn't until we were a good 10 miles away that my boss told me he'd heard stories about that area before, not just from locals, but from other brush pickers who'd worked those woods. Strange sounds, missing gear, the feeling of being watched. Nothing as direct as what I'd seen, but enough that he didn't want to take chances. That night, as the adrenaline wore off and my cuts stung in the shower, more details came back to me. The blood on the ground where the creature had been working, the dead animal, I'm pretty sure now it was a bear, draped over the bent tree. The way it moved, not clumsy like a bear, but with this terrible precision, and those eyes. God, those eyes. It's been almost a year now, and I still haven't gone back to those woods. I pick in other areas, always with partners, never alone. My boss never questioned my story or made me feel crazy about it. He just quietly took that whole section off our working map. Sometimes at night, I still wake up seeing those glowing red eyes staring at me. I've tried to make sense of what I saw. Was it a Sasquatch? Maybe, but nothing. I've read about Bigfoot mentions red eyes or that level of aggression. Whatever it was injured and angry, and I interrupted it while it was feeding. The thing that haunts me most is the intelligence I saw in those eyes. It wasn't just an animal reacting on instinct. There was something calculating there, something that recognized me as a threat, or maybe even as prey. Something that knew exactly what I was. I've told this story to exactly 3 people before writing it here. 2 of them think I had some kind of stress-induced hallucination. The third was an older guy who spent his whole life in these forests. He didn't say much, just nodded and told me I was lucky. When I asked Lucky how, he just said, "Lucky you saw it before it decided to see you." I don't know if there are more of these things out there. I don't know if what I saw was a one-of-a-kind creature or something else entirely. What I do know is that there are parts of those woods I'll never go back to, no matter how good the picking is supposed to be. And if you're ever out there, in the deep woods where the logging roads fade into nothing but deer trails, and you hear something that doesn't sound right, something tearing through the brush with a mix of growls and high-pitched squeals, Don't do what I did. Don't go looking for it. Just grab your gear and get out, because some things in this world aren't meant to be seen, and some eyes aren't meant to meet yours. No. Story 2: I've been hunting in Florida since I was just a kid. My granddad taught me everything I know about tracking, shooting, and respecting the wilderness. 30 years as a hunter, and I thought I'd seen it all. Gators, bears, panthers, you name it. But what happened to me in August of 2006 completely changed me. I still get cold sweats thinking about it. I was after wild hogs in Big Cypress National Preserve. Anyone who hunts in southern Florida knows those feral pigs are destructive as hell, tearing up the ecosystem, and there's good eating on them too. The state practically begs hunters to take them out. I had my 3 best dogs with me, Duke, Sadie, and Rex. They were trained specifically for boar hunting. Fearless animals who'd cornered animals twice their size without blinking. It was a typical August morning, already pushing 90 degrees by 7 in the morning. Humidity so thick you could almost swim through it. The preserve was gorgeous though, in that wild, untamed way that's getting harder to find these days. I remember the sun filtering through the cypress trees, making patterns on the water in the swampy areas. The sawgrass was tall that year, nearly chest high in places, which made tracking more challenging but not impossible for someone with my experience. I parked my old Ford at one of the service roads that cut through the preserve. There weren't many people around. Most folks with sense stay out of the deep swamp during summer. The mosquitoes alone are enough to drive you mad. But I came prepared with spray, proper clothing, plenty of water, and my Remington shotgun. I also had my hunting knife, GPS, and a satellite phone, since cell service is non-existent out there. The dogs were excited as always, tails wagging as I let them out of their kennels in the truck bed. They knew what we were doing and were eager to get started. I remember Duke, my oldest dog, a Catahoula mix, looking especially ready to work. He was always the leader, with Sadie and Rex following his lead. We set out along one of the game trails I've used for years. The dogs ran ahead, noses to the ground, occasionally checking back to make sure I was following. The morning was alive with sounds, birds calling, the splash of small animals in the water, insects buzzing. It was familiar territory, a place I'd hunted dozens of times before. About an hour in, we were deep in the preserve. The trees were thick overhead, creating a natural canopy that blocked much of the sky. The air was heavy with the smell of vegetation and stagnant water. The dogs had picked up a promising scent, and I was following their lead, watching for sign of hog activity, rooted up soil, tracks in the mud, broken vegetation. That's when it happened. Something I've never experienced before in all my years outdoors. The dogs just stopped, completely froze in their tracks. One minute they were excited, working a fresh trail, and the next they were stock still, ears perked forward, bodies rigid. Duke made a low growl in his throat that I'd never heard before. It wasn't his aggressive growl for when we cornered a hog. This was different, fearful, and then came the silence. It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it, but the swamp went completely, utterly silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. In all my years hunting, I'd never felt anything like it. It was wrong, unnatural. I raised my shotgun, thinking maybe we'd stumbled on a bear or a panther, but deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. The stillness was too complete, too overwhelming. The silence was shattered by an enormous crash about 50 yards ahead, like something massive moving through the underbrush. Then came a scream. Jesus, that scream. It wasn't human. It wasn't any animal I've ever heard. It was high-pitched but powerful, like it came from something with lungs 3 times the size of a man's. It echoed through the trees and seemed to vibrate in my chest. My dogs, my fearless, trained hunting dogs who had faced down 300-pound boars without hesitation, suddenly tucked their tails between their legs and bolted past me. They didn't even look at me as they fled, heading straight back toward the truck. In all our years hunting together, they had never, ever abandoned a hunt. The sight of those dogs running away in blind terror sent ice through my veins. I stood there alone, surrounded by sawgrass and cypress trees, my shotgun suddenly feeling very inadequate in my hands. The heavy footfalls continued, getting closer. Whatever it wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. I could hear branches snapping, vegetation being crushed. It sounded big, really big. My instinct was to run after the dogs, but my legs wouldn't move. Part of it was fear, sure, but part of it was also disbelief. I needed to see what could make my dogs react that way. So I did what any hunter would do. I took cover. I crouched behind a cluster of cabbage palms, trying to control my breathing, which suddenly seemed way too loud. The footsteps got closer, and then I saw it. About 40 yards away, pushing through a stand of palmettos, was something I still struggle to describe. It was massive, standing at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. It walked on 2 legs, but it wasn't human, not even close. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in what looked like huge hands. Its entire body was covered in hair, not fur but hair, dark brown and matted, looking dirty and tangled, especially around the shoulders and chest. The head is what I remember most clearly. It sat low on incredibly broad shoulders, almost like there wasn't much of a neck at all. The skull was sloped backward, with a heavy brow ridge over deep-set eyes. The nose was wide and flat, almost ape-like, but the face had a more human quality than any ape I've ever seen at the zoo. It was like something caught between man and animal, belonging to neither world completely. And then it screamed again. Standing there in the clearing, it opened its mouth and let out that same blood-curdling sound I'd heard before. Up close, it was deafening. I actually had to fight the urge to cover my ears. The sound seemed to roll through the trees like thunder. What happened next still gives me nightmares. The thing began moving around the clearing, almost like it was agitated or searching for something. It approached a dead tree and, with no apparent effort, ripped a massive chunk of bark and rotted wood right off the trunk. It wasn't struggling or straining. It was like watching someone peel a banana. The raw strength it displayed made my blood run cold. It sniffed at the exposed wood, then dropped it and moved to another tree, doing the same thing. It was methodical, almost like it was looking for insects or grubs. But then it stopped suddenly and lifted its head, nostrils flaring. It was scenting the air. It was scenting me. Slowly, deliberately, it turned its head toward my hiding place. Even from 40 yards away, I could feel its gaze lock onto me. Our eyes met, and in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at what locals call the skunk ape, Florida's own version of Bigfoot. I'd heard the stories my whole life, but had always laughed them off as campfire tales. I wasn't laughing now. The creature began walking toward me, not rushing but with purpose. Each step was silent despite its size, something that struck me as terribly wrong, something that big should make noise when it moves. The way it walked was odd too, kind of a rolling gait, shoulders swinging slightly. My hiding spot suddenly felt pathetically inadequate. I was a sitting duck, and this thing was coming right for me. In desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I stood up, yelled as loud as I could, and fired my shotgun into the air. The sound of the shot echoed through the trees, but the creature's reaction is what I'll never forget. It didn't run away like any normal animal would. Instead, it stopped, dropped into a lower stance, and let out a roar that made its previous scream seem tame by comparison. This wasn't a scared or surprised sound. This was a challenge, a threat. The message was clear. I was in its territory, and it wasn't afraid of me or my gun. We stood there, locked in a standoff that felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. My finger trembled on the trigger, but something told me that shooting this creature would be a terrible mistake. If I missed or only wounded it, I had no doubt it could reach me before I could reload, and based on the way it had torn apart that tree, I didn't like my chances in a close encounter. Finally, After what seemed like an eternity, the creature made a decision. It gave one last, lower growl, then deliberately stepped off the trail and into the dense vegetation. The foliage closed around it, and within seconds, despite its size, it had vanished completely. The ability of something so large to disappear so quickly and silently was perhaps the most unnerving part of the whole experience. I didn't wait around. The moment it was out of sight, I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, following the same trail back toward my truck. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me spinning around, sure that the creature was right behind me. But somehow, I made it back to the clearing where I'd parked. My dogs were already there, huddled against the truck, still trembling. I've never seen animals so terrified. Duke, my fearless lead dog, actually whimpered when I approached, something he'd never done before. It took me 3 tries to get my keys in the ignition because my hands were shaking so badly. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature staring at me, heard its scream echoing through the trees. I kept the shotgun by my bed, though I knew it would probably be useless if the thing decided to come for me. For months I told no one. Who would believe me? I've been hunting those swamps my whole life and never saw anything like it before. People would think I was crazy, or lying, or that I'd been drinking out in the heat. But I know what I saw. I know it was real. I still hunt, but never alone anymore, and never in Big Cypress. My dogs wouldn't go back there anyway. They start whining the moment we get close to that area. Sometimes I think animals know better than we do when something isn't right. I don't know what it was, skunk ape, Bigfoot, or something science hasn't classified yet. But it was intelligent. It knew I was there. It made decisions, and it let me go. Sometimes that's the part that bothers me most. It let me go, like it was choosing to spare me. I've spent my life in the Florida wilderness, but after that day, I realized there are some parts of it we still don't understand, and maybe aren't meant to. All I know is that I'll never set foot in that section of Big Cypress again. Some places should just be left alone. Story 3. I've been debating whether to write this down for years. Even now, my hands are shaking as I type. I'm not some attention seeker or storyteller. I'm a historian who specializes in the Pacific Northwest's forgotten histories, particularly those of Curry County, Oregon. 3 years ago, while researching local newspaper archives for my dissertation, I discovered something that's haunted me ever since. It started innocently enough. I was going through microfiche records from the late 19th century at the small Brookings Historical Society when I found a series of articles from 1890 that caught my attention. The headlines were alarming. 2 men found dead along Chetco River, and brutal killings spark fear in Curry County. The articles described how 2 men, Jacob Wheeler and Thomas Blackwood, both experienced hunters, had been discovered dead along the Chetco River banks, about 12 miles inland from what is now Brookings. What disturbed me most was the description of their bodies. According to the coroner's report, both men appeared to have been repeatedly slammed against the ground with tremendous force. Their rifles were found nearby, both having been fired multiple times. Being a thorough researcher, I dug deeper. I found additional reports of strange occurrences and unexplained sightings in the area during that same year. Local residents had reported seeing large, hairy creatures in the forests surrounding the river. At first, I dismissed these as typical frontier superstitions or exaggerations, but I couldn't leave it alone. Something about those deaths nagged at me. The violence described seemed excessive, inhuman. I decided to visit the location where the bodies had been found. The Historical Society had maps from that period, and I was able to pinpoint the approximate area. It was remote, even by today's standards, requiring a 4-mile hike from the nearest access road. I told myself it was for research purposes, but honestly, I was just morbidly curious. Last summer, I finally made the trip. I packed light, just water, some snacks, my notebook, a small digital camera, and a can of bear spray, just in case. I arrived at the trailhead early on a Tuesday morning in July. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, mild temperature, slight breeze, the kind of day that makes you feel invincible. The hike-in was pleasant enough, though the trail gradually disappeared as I moved deeper into the forest. Using my GPS and the historical maps, I continued pushing through increasingly dense vegetation. The Chetco River was always within earshot, a constant rushing companion. Around noon, I reached what I believed was the approximate location of the killings. It was an unremarkable clearing beside the river, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by towering Douglas firs and thick underbrush. The river was wider here, with a small gravelly beach. I sat down on a fallen log, ate a protein bar, and tried to imagine what might have happened here over 130 years ago. That's when I noticed how quiet it had become. The birds had stopped singing. Even the constant hum of insects had fallen silent. The only sound was the gentle flow of the river. I've spent enough time outdoors to know that sudden silence in a forest usually means something has disturbed the wildlife. I stood up, suddenly alert. I scanned the tree line, but saw nothing unusual. Still, that creeping sensation of being watched crawled up my spine. I decided to take some photos and notes quickly and then head back. As I was writing in my notebook, I heard a crack from across the clearing, the unmistakable sound of a large branch breaking under weight. I froze, my pen hovering over the page. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. No response. I slowly reached for my bear spray and held it ready. "I know someone's there," I said, trying to sound confident despite my racing heart. Another crack, closer this time, from a different direction. Whatever it was big and moving around the perimeter of the clearing. I started gathering my things, keeping my eyes on the tree line. That's when I noticed something that turned my blood cold. 3 deep gouges in the bark of a nearby tree, about 8 feet off the ground. They looked fresh, the exposed wood still light-colored and oozing sap. I couldn't rationalize those marks. They were too high for a bear, unless it had stood on its hind legs. But they didn't look like bear claws either. They were broader, more like fingers had dug into the bark. I needed to leave. Now, I shoved everything into my backpack and started walking, not running but moving quickly, back toward the trail. I'd gone maybe 50 feet when I heard it, a deep guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear or a cougar. It was something different, lower, almost like a human voice, but distorted through something inhuman. I broke into a run then, no longer caring about appearing calm. The forest seemed to close in around me as I crashed through underbrush, desperately trying to find the faint trail I'd followed in. Branches whipped at my face and arms, but I barely felt them. Behind me, I heard movement, heavy footfalls, branches snapping, undergrowth being pushed aside. Whatever was following me was big and fast. I remember thinking absurdly about those 2 men from 1890. Had they run like this? Had they felt this same primal terror before they died? I glanced back, just for a second, and saw movement among the trees, something large and dark, moving parallel to my path. It was keeping pace with me effortlessly, staying just out of clear sight. My foot caught on a root and I went down hard, my knee striking a rock. Pain shot up my leg, but adrenaline pushed me back to my feet immediately. I dropped my bear spray in the fall and couldn't spot it in the undergrowth. No time to look. As I staggered forward, something large crashed through the trees to my right, cutting across my path ahead. I skidded to a stop, heart hammering in my chest. There, partially obscured by foliage but unmistakably present, stood a figure. It was tall, at least 7 feet, and covered in dark, matted hair. Its silhouette was powerfully built, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung almost to its knees. I couldn't see its face clearly, thank God. Just a darker patch within the hair-covered head, and what might have been eyes reflecting the dappled sunlight. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to run, unable even to scream. It made that sound again, that deep growling sound that seemed to vibrate the air between us. Then it moved, just slightly, shifting its weight forward as if preparing to charge. That movement broke my paralysis. I turned and ran in the only direction available, straight toward the river. I had some half-formed plan to cross it, thinking maybe the creature wouldn't follow through water. I burst out of the trees onto a rocky outcropping about 10 feet above the river. The water below looked deep enough, but the current was strong. I hesitated for just a moment. Behind me, trees shook and branches snapped as the thing pursued me. I jumped. The cold water was a shock that almost made me gasp in a lungful of river. The current immediately grabbed me, spinning me downstream. I fought to keep my head above water, kicking and stroking toward the opposite bank. When I finally dragged myself out, shivering and coughing, I was maybe a quarter-mile downstream from where I jumped in. My backpack was still miraculously on my shoulders, though soaked through. I looked back across the river, scanning the bank where I jumped from. At first I saw nothing. Then movement caught my eye. It was standing there, a dark silhouette against the green forest backdrop, watching me. It made no attempt to cross the river. It just watched. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I scrambled up the bank and pushed through the forest on this side of the river, hoping to eventually circle back to the trail and my car. It took me 4 terrifying hours of bushwhacking, repeatedly checking behind me and fighting panic to finally reach the road, about a mile from where I'd parked. I jogged the rest of the way, constantly looking over my shoulder. The drive back to town is a blur in my memory. I remember stopping at a gas station bathroom to clean up the cuts on my face and arms, trying to make myself presentable enough that I wouldn't attract attention. That night in my motel room, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made me jolt upright. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to convince myself it had been a bear, or even another hiker playing a sick joke. But I knew better. The next morning, I checked out early and drove straight to the Historical Society. I spent the entire day going through every newspaper article, journal, and report from 1890 that mentioned the killings or the hairy creatures. What I found chilled me further. After the deaths of Wheeler and Blackwood, local residents had formed armed patrols to hunt down whatever had killed the men. They found nothing, but the reports described finding similar gouges in trees, enormous footprints, and strange hair samples that didn't match any known animal. Most disturbing was a journal entry from the local doctor who examined the bodies. He noted that both men had fired their weapons. Forensics confirmed this through gunpowder residue on their hands, but no blood trail from a wounded animal was ever found. Whatever they shot at either wasn't hit or wasn't affected by the bullets. Before I left town, I spoke with an elderly local historian who'd lived in the area his whole life. When I carefully broached the subject of the 1890 killings, his face changed. He told me that the locals had always avoided that stretch of the Chetco River. The indigenous people had legends about forest giants that protected certain territories, and early settlers had their own stories of encounters with wild men in those same areas. He also mentioned something that hadn't appeared in any of the official records. After those 2 deaths in 1890, 3 more men went missing in the same area over the next decade. Their bodies were never found. I've spent the past 3 years trying to rationalize what happened that day. I've researched every animal native to Oregon that could explain what I saw. Nothing fits. I've looked into local legends and found similarities to Bigfoot or Sasquatch stories, but those have always seemed like folklore to me, not reality. The logical part of my brain says it was a bear. The honest part knows it wasn't. I still have nightmares about those moments by the river. In them, I'm always running, and that thing is always just behind me, its growl vibrating in my chest. Sometimes I don't make it to the river. Sometimes it catches me, and I feel those powerful hands grabbing me, lifting me, slamming me down against the forest floor again and again until I wake up screaming. I haven't gone back to Curry County. My dissertation remains unfinished. My academic career stalled. I can't explain to my advisor why I abandoned my research. Who would believe me? All I know is that something killed those men in 1890, and I believe it's still out there, protecting its territory along the Chetco River. Something that's managed to remain hidden for over a century, emerging only when it feels threatened. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if it followed me home. Story 4. I still can't explain what we saw that day in the mountains, and I'm not sure I want to. It's been nearly 20 years, but August 9th, 2004 is burned into my memory like a brand. I've spent my whole life in the woods, 15 years of heli-logging in British Columbia before that day, and I'd never seen anything that made me question what I thought I knew about the wilderness, until White Swan Lake. Our crew had been working that area for about 3 weeks. It was good timber, old growth, and the location was remote enough that we were being flown in each morning by chopper. Me and Dave would usually get dropped first at the landing area to set up for the day, while the pilot went back for the rest of the crew. That Monday started like any other. We got the call at 4:30, grabbed breakfast at the motel, and were at the staging area by 6. The sky was just getting light when we loaded up, and by 7:30 the chopper was setting us down at the landing zone. Normal routine. One thing about that site, we'd gotten used to seeing mountain goats on the ridge across from our landing area. Every morning, like clockwork, they'd be up there grazing. Dave and I would usually spot them while we were setting up the equipment. It became this little game, counting how many we could see. But that morning, as the helicopter pulled away and the rotor wash died down, I looked up at the ridge and immediately knew something was different. "Dave," I said, my voice probably sounding strange because he looked up at me sharply. "Look at the ridge. What do you see?" He shaded his eyes and looked. "No goats today." "No, but look at the left side, near that stand of dead pines." It took him a few seconds. Then I saw his body language change completely. "What the fuck is that?" he whispered. Standing there in plain view on the ridgeline about 3/4 of a mile away was something massive and brown, walking on 2 legs, moving with purpose along the ridge. At first, my brain tried to make it a bear, had to be a grizzly standing up, but it never dropped to all 4s, and the way it moved was all wrong. The gait was smooth, deliberate, human-like, but with a longer stride, and the size, Jesus, the size of it. We had radios to communicate with the other crews, but they were for work purposes. I couldn't bring myself to call it in. What would I even say? Instead, Dave ran to his pack and pulled out a pair of binoculars. "Holy shit," he said when he got them focused. His face went pale. "It's not a bear, Mike." He handed me the binoculars with shaking hands. It took me a moment to find the figure, but when I did, my stomach dropped. The creature was walking upright, arms swinging slightly at its sides, brown, not black, with what looked like shorter hair on its face and longer hair on its shoulders and back. The proportions were all wrong for a human, too massive through the chest and shoulders, arms too long. The height was impossible to judge precisely at that distance, but using the trees as reference, we later estimated it had to be at least 11 feet tall, maybe more. "Are you seeing this?" I asked Dave, my mouth dry. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'm seeing it." For nearly 20 minutes, we watched that thing traverse the ridge. Neither of us spoke much. What was there to say? Everything I thought I knew about the woods was being dismantled in real time. At one point, the creature just stopped, stood completely still for about 5 minutes, so still that I temporarily lost sight of it against the tree line, like it was trying to blend in, become part of the forest. Then it moved again, and my eyes snapped back to it. Just before we heard the helicopter returning with the rest of the crew, the creature did something that eliminated any lingering doubt in my mind that this was some weird bear behavior. It bent forward at the waist, like a person touching their toes, then straightened back up, a deliberate human-like movement. No bear moves like that. No bear moves like a person doing morning stretches. When the chopper sounds got louder, the creature moved quickly into the tree line and disappeared. The helicopter landed, and the rest of the crew jumped out. Tom, our foreman, immediately noticed something was off with us. "You two look like you've seen a ghost," he said, half joking. Dave and I exchanged glances. These were guys we'd worked with for years, trusted with our lives in dangerous situations daily. But even so, I hesitated. "We saw something on the ridge," I finally said, not sure what it was. "Big," Dave added, "moving on two legs." I expected laughter, jokes about the altitude getting to us. Instead, Tom got quiet, serious. "Show me where," he said. We pointed to the ridge, explained what we'd seen. By then, whatever it was had vanished completely. Tom stared at the ridge for a long minute, then turned to the crew. "Keep your eyes open today," was all he said. Then we got to work. The rest of that day was tense. We did our jobs. We always did our jobs. But everyone was distracted, scanning the surrounding forest. No one wanted to say the word, but we were all thinking it. Sasquatch to Bigfoot, the thing that wasn't supposed to exist. 3 days later, on Thursday, we found the tracks. We'd moved to a new section, about half a mile from where we'd made the sighting. We were cutting a path through some dense underbrush when Kyle, one of the younger guys, called out, "Hey, check this out!" We gathered around what he'd found, clear impressions in a muddy patch of ground. Footprints, massive footprints, about 16 inches long and 7 inches wide. The stride length between them was huge, easily over 4 feet. Tom knelt down beside one, placing his hand next to it for scale. His hand looked child-sized in comparison. "Bear?" someone suggested, but without conviction. Tom shook his head. "Bears don't walk like this." He traced the outline. "Look at the heel impression, the arch, the 5 toes. This is a foot, a fucking huge foot, but a foot." We took some photos with the disposable camera Tom kept in his pack for documenting work sites. I wish we'd had better equipment, but this was 2004. None of us carried smartphones back then, just those cheap yellow Kodak cameras. The mood in camp that night was subdued. We were staying at a small motel about an hour's drive from the site, and after dinner, most of the guys gathered in Tom's room. There was beer, but not much drinking. Mostly just quiet conversation about what we'd seen and what it might mean. Several of the older guys shared stories they'd heard over the years, other logging crews with similar experiences, strange encounters in remote areas, stories they'd previously dismissed but were now reconsidering. "My grandfather was Stolo," Kyle said quietly. "He used to tell us about Sasquatch, said they were guardians of the forest, that they'd been here since the beginning. I always thought they were just stories." No one mocked him. That's the thing I remember most about that night, the complete absence of ridicule. 20 hardened loggers, men who'd give each other shit about absolutely anything, and not one joke was made. On August 31st, our last day of the season at that site, I had my second encounter. I'd been sent to check out a new access road that had been cut the day before. It had rained overnight, and the ground was soft, muddy in places, perfect for tracking. I was alone, about a quarter mile from the main work area, when I came across a set of 4 clear footprints in a muddy section of the new road. Fresh. They hadn't been there when the road was cut the previous day, and the rain had stopped around 5 that morning. These were different from the prints we'd found earlier. They were about the same length as my size 12 boots, around 12 inches. but much wider, maybe 6 inches across, and the toes were enormous, splayed out like fingers. I took photos, measured them using my boot as reference. Later, when we compared the 2 sets of prints, Tom suggested that the larger prints might have been an adult, and these newer ones could be from a juvenile, a kid. The thought of there being a family of these creatures in the area was both fascinating and terrifying. That was our last day at White Swan Lake. The contract was complete, and we moved on to a new site the following week. But things were different after that. I found myself scanning ridgelines, looking into shadows. The forest had changed for me, or rather, my understanding of it had. I've never spoken publicly about what we saw. A few of us have discussed it over the years, usually late at night after a few drinks. Dave left logging the following year, said he couldn't handle being in the deep woods anymore, not after what we'd seen. Tom kept all the photos in a file, promised to get them developed properly, but his house burned down in 2007. Everything was lost. I still work in the industry, though I've moved to ground logging operations closer to populated areas. Sometimes I wonder if that's related to what happened, if some part of me is avoiding those remote places now. I don't know what we saw that day at White Swan Lake. I can't explain it in a way that fits with what I was taught about the natural world. But I know what I saw. I know what all of us saw. And I know that the wilderness holds secrets we've barely begun to understand. To this day, I still catch myself looking up at ridgelines, searching for a tall, brown figure walking where no person should be. Ordeal. Story 5. I still can't explain what happened to us that night in August 2006. It's been nearly 18 years, but I remember every second like it was yesterday. The whole experience lasted maybe 2 minutes, but it changed how I look at the woods forever. I was driving my Ford F-250 with my stepson Derek and his girlfriend Amber. We were headed to Port Renfrew on Vancouver Island for a weekend fishing trip. It was around 9:30 at night, pitch black out there on those forest roads. We had our small fishing boat on a trailer behind us. Nothing fancy, just a 16-footer with an outboard motor that we use for coastal fishing. The drive to Port Renfrew is beautiful during the day, but honestly, kind of creepy at night. For those who don't know the area, it's incredibly remote. Dense, old-growth forest right up to the road edges. No streetlights, no houses, no cell service, just trees, darkness, and the occasional logging road turnoff. We were about 20 kilometers south of the Massachi Lake turnoff when Derek needed to take a leak. I pulled over, he hopped out and went behind some bushes, and we were back on the road in less than 5 minutes. We'd gone maybe 250 meters, not even a quarter mile, when Derek asked if we could stop again so he could change the CD. I remember being slightly annoyed, but I pulled over, put the truck in park, and left the engine running. I flicked on the interior dome light so he could see what he was doing. Amber was sitting on the passenger side, and Derek was in the middle. We were just sitting there, the radio momentarily silent as Derek fumbled with the CD case. That's when it happened. The first sensation was the truck moving, not forward or backward, but sideways, like a violent lurching motion from side to side. My first thought was that we were sliding off the road. Maybe the shoulder was giving way. My heart immediately jumped into my throat. "Dad, what's happening? Are we rolling?" Derek shouted, dropping the CDs all over the floor. I gripped the steering wheel tight, checking the gear shift. "We're in park! Brakes on! We're not moving!" But we were moving. The entire truck was rocking back and forth with increasing violence. It wasn't subtle. We're talking about a heavy-duty truck with a boat and trailer being shaken like a toy. The steering wheel was jerking in my hands. Then came the noise. This weird mix of metal creaking and what sounded like heavy breathing outside. I couldn't place it. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. Amber, who was sitting by the window, suddenly screamed. "Something's pushing the boat. Oh my God, look at the trailer." I twisted around in my seat and looked through the rear window. In the red glow of the taillights, I could see our boat and trailer being pushed toward the edge of the road. The trailer was at an angle it shouldn't have been, like something was shoving it sideways with considerable force. Derek was frantically looking out the windows, but between the darkness and the condensation forming from our panicked breathing, visibility was shit. I don't see anything. What is it? The rocking got more violent. I swear to God, the passenger side wheels lifted off the ground for a second. Something hit the side of the truck, not like a branch scraping, but like a deliberate thump, hard enough to dent the door panel, which I discovered later. Amber was full on crying now. "Get us out of here, please, just go." I didn't need to be told twice. I stomped on the gas pedal so hard I'm surprised it didn't go through the floor. The tires spun for a second before catching, and we shot forward with the trailer swinging wildly behind us. Whatever had been pushing on it must have let go, because we didn't drag anything with us. I didn't slow down for at least 5 kilometers. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the wheel straight. Nobody spoke. We just kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see something following us, but there was nothing but darkness. When we finally reached the small motel in Port Renfrew, we checked in without even looking at the boat. We were too scared. I remember locking and double-checking the motel room door, then putting a chair against it. None of us slept much that night. In the morning light, we went out to inspect the damage, and holy shit, there was plenty. The main safety latch that connected the boat to the trailer, a heavy-duty metal piece designed to secure a boat during highway travel, was stretched and basically useless. Not broken, but bent and stretched like something had pulled on it with incredible force. The nylon safety cable was frayed and split in places. The tie-down straps at the rear of the boat, the ones that keep it from bouncing, were torn and stretched beyond use. Derek kept saying it had to be a bear, but I've dealt with bears before. Bears don't silently approach a running vehicle with people inside. They don't rock a 3-ton truck and trailer, and they definitely don't disappear without a trace. We debated whether to leave immediately, but we'd planned this trip for months, and the motel was non-refundable. Plus, I think we all felt a little safer in daylight, surrounded by other people in the small fishing town. So we stayed. But none of us wanted to go back to that section of road. The fishing was terrible that weekend. None of us could focus. Every noise in the woods made us jump. Every shadow on the water seemed threatening. We packed up a day early and headed home, taking a longer route that avoided that specific stretch of road. But before we left the area completely, something made me want to go back and look at that spot in daylight. I can't explain why. Maybe I needed to prove to myself there was a logical explanation. So on our way out, against Derek and Amber's protests, I drove back to where I thought we'd stopped. There was nothing there. No signs of a landslide or road damage. No fallen trees. No obvious animal tracks that we could see from the road. I didn't dare get out to look more closely. Something about that spot still felt wrong, even in daylight. I've gone over that night 1,000 times in my mind. We had crab bait with us, but it was in sealed containers in the truck bed, not in the boat, where it might attract animals. There were no claw marks anywhere on the vehicle or boat. The damage to the trailer attachments wasn't consistent with anything sliding or falling. It was like something had grabbed the boat and was trying to pull it off the trailer. We've never talked about it much outside the family. People assume you're crazy or drunk when you describe something like this. For years, I told myself it was just a small landslide or earth movement that we couldn't see in the dark. But deep down, I know that's bullshit. The way that truck moved wasn't natural. The force required to damage those heavy-duty boat attachments wasn't small. A few months later, I was talking to a forestry worker at a local pub who worked in that area. Without giving details of our experience, I asked if there had been any strange reports near that section of road. He got real quiet, took a long sip of his beer and said, "You saw something out there, didn't you?" When I hesitated, he nodded like he understood and said, That whole area has stories. Loggers don't like working there after dark. Some won't go alone even during the day. He wouldn't elaborate further, just advised me to be careful on those roads at night. I've since done some research into the Port Renfrew area. The local First Nations have legends about wild men in the forests. Some call them Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I was never a believer in that stuff. Still don't know if I am. But I can't explain what happened to us that night. Whatever it was powerful enough to rock a truck and trailer, smart enough to approach without being seen, and interested enough in us to investigate rather than run away. The strangest part? I sometimes wonder if it was trying to help us. The road does get dangerous further ahead. There's a sharp turn with a steep drop-off. But then I remember the violence of the rocking, the sound of that breathing, and the damage to our equipment. And I know that wasn't a friendly encounter. Derek and Amber broke up a year later, but not before making a pact never to drive that road again. I've kept the same promise to myself. There are other ways to get to Port Renfrew. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm not even sure what I believe happened. But something was out there in those woods that night. Something big enough and strong enough to shake a truck and trailer like a dog with a toy. And whatever it was, I hope to God I never encounter it again. To this day, when I'm driving on dark forest roads and I have to pull over, I leave the engine running and my foot hovering over the gas pedal. Some lessons you only need to learn once. Story 6, Dumna. I don't talk about this much anymore. Actually, almost never. When I do, people either think I'm nuts or making it up for attention. But what happened back in December of 2013, when I was 12 years old, was real. I know it was real because my cousin Joey saw it too, and we still talk about it sometimes when it's just us. It was winter break, and my parents had dropped me off at my aunt and uncle's farm in Morton, Mississippi for a few days. Joey lived there, and we were super close growing up, like brothers more than cousins. Their property was this awesome place for kids. About 30 acres with woods, a small pond, and these big open fields where my uncle kept some cattle. That morning, it was weirdly warm for December. I remember because I was just wearing a hoodie, not even a real jacket. Joey and I had been sitting on the front porch of their farmhouse for like an hour, bored out of our minds trying to figure out what to do. My aunt had made us breakfast earlier. Pancakes with this homemade blackberry syrup that I still dream about sometimes. But now it was around 11 in the morning and we had the whole day ahead of us. We could ride the three-wheeler around the back field, Joey suggested, for probably the third time. My uncle had this old ATV that he let us use sometimes if we promised to be careful. I was about to agree when something at the edge of the property caught my eye. The farm had this line of trees that separated their land from the neighbors, and I swear to God, standing right at the edge of those trees was something. At first, I thought it was just some really tall guy. "Joey," I said, my voice coming out all weird and quiet, "look over there." I pointed toward the tree line. He squinted. "What am I looking at?" "By the big oak. Do you see that person?" Except as I said it, I realized it wasn't a person at all. This thing was huge, like freakishly tall, and it was covered in this thick reddish-brown hair, like a bear, but not a bear's shape at all. It stood upright like a human, but had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. The only part that didn't have hair was its face, which I could make out even from that distance. The skin looked tough and leathery, kind of grayish-brown. Its head was shaped weird too, kind of pointed at the top, not round like a human head. Joey must have finally seen it, because he made this gasping sound and grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. We both just froze, staring at this thing. It seemed to be looking in our direction, but I couldn't tell if it actually saw us sitting on the porch. It had these incredibly long arms that hung down way past where a normal person's would end. Then something happened that I still can't explain. The creature suddenly jerked its head to look deeper into the woods behind it, like it heard something that scared it. And then it started running. Holy shit! The way this thing moved, it took these massive strides across my uncle's pasture, covering ground faster than any human could. Its arms swung with this weird rhythm that didn't look natural. The craziest part? There was a 5-foot barbed wire fence dividing the pasture in half, and this thing didn't even slow down. It just leaped over it like it was nothing, cleared the whole thing without breaking stride. I remember thinking my uncle's prize bull had trouble with that same fence last summer. We watched it sprint across the rest of the field toward the livestock pond, and right before it disappeared back into the trees on the other side, it ducked under this big tree branch. The branch that I later figured out was easily 7 feet off the ground, and then it was gone. For a few seconds, Joey and I just sat there in complete shock. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Did you just see?" Joey started. "Bigfoot," I finished. "We just saw a freaking Bigfoot." We looked at each other, and I could tell we were both thinking the same thing. We needed to check this out right now before any evidence disappeared. Without saying another word, we both jumped up and ran to the side of the barn where my uncle kept the 3-wheeler. It was this old red Honda that had definitely seen better days, but it still ran great. Joey jumped on first, and I climbed on behind him, and we took off across the field, following the exact path we'd watched the creature take. In hindsight, we were idiots. We were so excited to find proof that we didn't even think about the fact that we were probably destroying any footprints with the ATV's tires. But we were 12, you know? All we could think was that we needed to get there fast before whatever we saw completely disappeared. We rode across the pasture, and Joey had to slow down to navigate through the gate in the fence. Unlike the creature, we couldn't just jump over it. When we got to the spot where we'd seen it duck under the tree branch, we both climbed off the 3-wheeler and just stood there looking up. The branch was way higher than my head. I was about 5'4" back then, and I couldn't even reach it when I jumped and stretched my arms up. Joey was a little taller than me, and he couldn't touch it either. "Jacob, that thing had to duck to go under this," Joey said, his voice all quiet and serious. "It had to be 7, maybe 8 feet tall." We looked around for footprints, but the ground was covered in these dead leaves and pine needles that didn't show much. We found one spot where it looked like something big had disturbed the ground, like a heel print maybe, but it wasn't clear enough to be sure. We spent at least an hour searching the area, looking for hair, footprints, anything, but we didn't find any real evidence. Eventually, we got back on the 3-wheeler and headed back to the house, both of us quiet, trying to process what we'd seen. When we got back, my aunt was starting to make lunch. "Where have you boys been?" she asked. Joey and I looked at each other, and I could see the excitement in his eyes. We couldn't wait to tell them. "Aunt Sarah, we saw something in the woods," I blurted out. "Something big." My Uncle Tom was sitting at the kitchen table reading a newspaper. He lowered it and raised an eyebrow. "What, like a deer?" "No," Joey said. "We think it was Bigfoot." The kitchen got really quiet for a second, and then my uncle started laughing. Not just a chuckle, but a full-on belly laugh that made his face turn red. "Bigfoot in Morton, Mississippi?" He slapped his knee. "That's a good one, boys." My aunt was trying to be nicer about it. "Are you sure it wasn't just Mr. Daniels from down the road? He's a pretty tall fellow, and he hunts on our back 40 sometimes." "It wasn't a person," I insisted. "It was covered in reddish hair, and it jumped over the fence in the middle pasture without even slowing down. No human can do that." My uncle was still laughing. "You boys have quite the imagination. Maybe you should write science fiction stories." Joey's older sister Megan came into the kitchen then. "What's so funny?" "The boys say they spotted Sasquatch out by the pond," my aunt explained, with this smile that made it clear she didn't believe us for a second. Megan rolled her eyes. "Right. And I'm dating Taylor Swift." We tried to explain exactly what we'd seen, the height, the hair, the way it moved, But the more details we added, the more they all seemed to think we were making it up. By dinner that night, it had become a family joke. Uncle Tom kept asking if Bigfoot wanted to join us for dessert, and Megan pretended to see one outside the window, making everyone laugh. It hurt, to be honest. We knew what we saw. It wasn't a joke or a made-up story. But no one believed us. That night, Joey and I were in his room. He had these glow-in-the-dark stars on his ceiling that we were staring at in the dark. "They don't believe us," I said. "I know," Joey replied, "but we know what we saw. Maybe we should go back tomorrow with a camera, try to find some evidence." Joey was quiet for a minute. Would it matter? They'd just say we faked whatever we found. He was right. We both knew it. Without clear evidence, like the thing standing right in front of them, no one was going to believe two 12-year-old boys claiming they saw Bigfoot. The rest of my visit, we stopped talking about it around the family. It wasn't worth the eye rolls and jokes, but when it was just us, we'd discuss what we saw, comparing details to make sure we remembered the same thing. And we always did. The reddish-brown hair, the pointed head, the leathery face, the incredible speed and strength as it cleared that fence. That was 10 years ago now. I'm 22 and Joey's 23. We both went to different colleges, but we still keep in touch, and sometimes, when we're together and no one else is around, one of us will bring up that day. "Remember that thing we saw at your parents' farm?" I'll ask, and Joey will nod, his expression serious. "Yeah, I still think about it sometimes." What's weird is that after it happened, we both got really into researching Bigfoot. We'd spend hours online reading other people's encounters, comparing them to what we saw. So many of the details matched. The height, the hair color, the way it moved. It made us feel less crazy, knowing other people had seen similar things. I've never seen anything like it again, but that one encounter was enough to convince me these creatures exist. Joey feels the same way. We don't have proof. We don't have photos or footprint casts or hair samples. All we have is what we saw with our own eyes that December day in 2013. I know most people reading this probably think I'm just making this up, or that we mistook some normal animal for something extraordinary. That's fine. I'm used to not being believed, but I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear standing on its hind legs. It wasn't a man in a costume who would be wandering around private property in rural Mississippi in a Bigfoot costume. It wasn't a deer or a cow or anything else that belongs on a farm. It was something that shouldn't exist according to science, but does. Something that most people will go their whole lives without seeing. But Joey and I were lucky, or unlucky, enough to witness. I don't expect this post to convince anyone. I'm just putting it out there because sometimes I need to remind myself that it really happened. That for a few minutes on a warm December day in Morton, Mississippi, my cousin and I saw something that changed how we understand the world. Something that most people only see in movies or read about in books. We saw Bigfoot, and no amount of disbelief from others will ever change that. Story 7. I still don't know how to explain what happened to me back in 2010. It's been over a decade, but the memory of that night at my buddy Mike's hunting cabin still makes my skin crawl. I've told this story to a few close friends, but they usually think I'm exaggerating or had too much whiskey that night. I wasn't drunk, though. I was stone-cold sober by the time it all went down. It was early December, just after Thanksgiving. I'd been dealing with a lot of stress at work and needed to get away for a few days. Mike had offered his hunting cabin west of Curlew, Washington. If you don't know where Curlew is, it's basically the middle of nowhere in the northeastern part of the state, right by the Canadian border. The cabin was pretty isolated, about 4 miles down an old logging road, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. I brought my 2 dogs with me, Duke, a shepherd lab mix, and Sadie, who's part hound, and who knows what else. They're good companions, and I figured they'd enjoy running around in the woods. Plus, I'm not gonna lie, having them there made me feel safer in such a remote location. The first day was great. I hiked around with the dogs, gathered firewood, and just enjoyed the quiet. No cell service, no internet, no people, just what I needed. That night, I lit the wood stove, cooked some dinner, read a bit by lantern light, and went to bed early. Slept like a rock. The second day was more of the same. I explored farther into the woods, following an old game trail. I remember noticing how quiet it seemed. Hardly any birds, no squirrels chattering. At the time, I didn't think much of it. It was December, after all. But looking back now, I should have paid more attention to that silence. I got back to the cabin around 4 in the afternoon as it was starting to get dark, fed the dogs, made myself some chili, and settled in with a book. The cabin was simple. One main room with a kitchenette and small living area, plus a tiny bedroom off to the side. Wood paneling everywhere, a few hunting trophies on the walls, typical guy stuff. The bathroom was an outhouse about 30 feet from the back door. Around 11:30, I decided to turn in. I let the dogs out one last time, banking the fire in the wood stove so it would last through the night. The temperature was supposed to drop into the 20s, and the cabin got cold fast without that stove going. I was almost asleep when I heard it. A solid thump against the west wall of the cabin. It was loud enough that I sat straight up in bed. My first thought was that a branch had fallen from one of the pines near the cabin, but then it happened again. Thump. Harder this time, like someone had taken a baseball bat and swung it full force against the wall. Duke and Sadie were instantly alert, both of them jumping off the bed, but they weren't barking like they normally would if they heard something outside. Instead, they were both standing stiff-legged in the middle of the room, hackles raised, staring at the wall where the sound had come from. Thump, thump. 2 more hits, moving around toward the front of the cabin. Whatever was causing it was circling the building. And these weren't random. They were deliberate, powerful impacts that made the whole structure shudder. I'm not exaggerating when I say I could feel the floor vibrate under my feet. I grabbed my flashlight and Mike's old .306 rifle that he keeps mounted above the door. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the ammo while loading it. Another massive thump hit the front wall, and this time I heard the distinct sound of the porch boards creaking, like something very heavy was walking on them. I moved to the window, staying to the side of it rather than standing directly in front. Using the barrel of the rifle, I nudged the curtain aside just enough to peek out. It was a clear night with a half moon, so I could see the porch and the yard beyond it pretty well. There was nothing visible, but I could still hear heavy footsteps moving across the porch. That's when I heard it. A growl so deep and powerful that it seemed to vibrate the glass in the window. It wasn't like a bear or a cougar or any animal I've ever heard. And I've been hunting since I was a kid. This sound came from something massive, something with lungs and vocal cords bigger than any normal animal should have. The growl rumbled on for what felt like forever, rising and falling in pitch. I swear to God I could feel it in my chest, like when you're at a concert and stand too close to the speakers. The dogs were freaking out now, but not in the way they normally would. Instead of barking and trying to get at whatever was outside, they were backing away, whining. Sadie crawled under the bed, and Duke tried to follow her, but he's too big, so he just pressed himself against my legs, trembling. Another thump, this one against the back wall, near where the wood stove pipe goes out. Then more heavy footsteps circling back around to the front. Whatever it was methodically working its way around the entire cabin, hitting the walls as it went. I moved to another window, trying to catch a glimpse of it. The moonlight cast long shadows from the trees, and for a second I thought I saw something move near the edge of the clearing, something huge and dark that seemed to blend with the tree line. But it was gone so fast I couldn't be sure. The next impact was different. It sounded like something had struck one of the porch support posts. Crack! The whole front of the cabin seemed to shift slightly, and I heard things falling off shelves in the kitchen area. The lantern I'd left on the table swayed dangerously. Another growl, this one sounding closer, like it was right outside the front door. Then something scraped against the wood. Not like claws exactly, but a deliberate, slow scraping that sent splinters flying. I could see them falling past the window. I was scared shitless by this point. I'd backed myself into the corner of the room furthest from the front door, rifle aimed and ready, though I wasn't sure what good it would do against something that could shake an entire cabin. The dogs had both disappeared under the bed now. Even Duke had somehow squeezed his big body under there. For the next hour, this thing continued circling the cabin, hitting the walls, growling, and occasionally scraping against the wood. It was like it was testing the structure, looking for weak points. Or maybe it was just trying to scare the hell out of me. If so, it was working. Around 1 in the morning, the sound started to decrease. The impacts became less frequent, the footsteps more distant. I heard that deep growl one more time, but it seemed to be coming from the edge of the clearing. Then, silence. I didn't move from my spot in the corner. I kept the rifle ready and stayed awake all night, jumping at every creak and groan of the cabin settling. The dogs refused to come out from under the bed. As soon as I saw the first hint of dawn through the windows, I began packing my stuff. I wasn't staying another night, no matter what. But before I left, I needed to see if there was any evidence of what had happened. I cautiously opened the front door, rifle ready, and stepped onto the porch. What I saw made my blood run cold. All around the cabin, circling it completely, were footprints in the half-frozen ground. But these weren't animal tracks, at least not from any animal I recognized. They were bare footprints, huge, easily 16 inches long, with 5 clearly defined toes. They were pressed deep into the soil, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. And the stride length. Jesus. They were spaced about 4 feet apart. No human walks with a 4-foot stride. I followed them around to where they approached the porch post nearest the door. There, about 5.5 feet up the post, were 4 parallel scratches gouged deep into the wood. Fresh wood curls were still hanging from the bottom of the marks. Whatever had made those scratches had to be tall, really tall, 7 feet at minimum, probably more. That was all I needed to see. I went back inside, grabbed my stuff and the dogs, and was in my truck and heading down that logging road within 15 minutes. The dogs were still so spooked, they didn't even want to go outside to pee. I had to practically drag them. It took me a while to tell Mike what happened. When I finally did, he was quiet for a long time. Then he told me something that made everything worse. Apparently, other people who've stayed at the cabin have reported strange sounds at night. Nothing as extreme as what I experienced, but enough that he probably should have warned me. I've spent a lot of time trying to rationalize what happened that night. Could it have been a bear? Maybe. But bears don't walk on 2 legs for extended periods, and they don't have fingers to make those parallel scratches. A person playing a prank. Out there, miles from anywhere, in freezing December temperatures, and no human I know can make a growl that seems to vibrate the air itself. The only explanation that makes any sense, as crazy as it sounds, is that it was a Sasquatch. I know how that sounds, believe me. I wasn't a believer before this. But that growl, it didn't come from a throat built for a normal animal, and those footprints, bipedal huge, with a stride length impossible for a human. I think it was deliberately trying to intimidate me, to drive me away from its territory. The way it methodically circled the cabin, the display of strength by slapping the walls and scratching the post, it felt like a warning. I haven't been back to that cabin since, and I never will. Mike still uses it for hunting trips, but always brings at least 2 other guys with him now. As for me, I stick to campgrounds these days, places with other people nearby, and I never ever go into those deep woods alone anymore. The dogs haven't been the same either. Duke used to love hiking and camping, but now he gets anxious whenever we're in heavily wooded areas. And Sadie, she still hides under the bed whenever there's a thunderstorm or any loud, unexpected noise. Whatever was outside that cabin that night, it wasn't just a random animal wandering by. It was intelligent, it was powerful, and it wanted me gone. Story 8. I still get this sick feeling in my stomach when I think about what happened last year. Writing this is hard, but maybe it'll help me process everything. I've been lurking in this community for months, reading everyone else's experiences, and I finally worked up the courage to share mine. It was early May of 2019. The weather in Michigan had finally turned nice after that brutal winter, and my wife Diana suggested we take the kids for a picnic in the Porcupine Mountains. We'd been there a few times before. Beautiful area with dense forests, rivers, and some spectacular views. Our kids, Emma, 11, and Tyler, 8, were excited about the trip. They'd been cooped up all winter too, and they needed to burn off some energy. We packed a pretty standard picnic: sandwiches, chips, fruit, some cookies Diana had baked the night before. I remember Emma insisting we bring her new binoculars she'd gotten for her birthday. Tyler brought his favorite action figures because that kid never goes anywhere without them. We arrived around 11 in the morning. The parking lot only had 3 other cars, which was perfect. Diana and I both wanted some peace and quiet, away from crowds. We chose a trail that followed a small creek, one that wasn't too challenging for the kids, but would still let us get deep enough into the woods to feel like we were really in nature. The hike was beautiful. Spring wildflowers were starting to bloom. The creeks were running high from the snowmelt. Tyler spotted a deer about 20 minutes in, which got him all excited. Emma kept using her binoculars to look for birds. Everything was perfect, exactly what we needed as a family. About an hour and a half into our hike, we found this perfect little clearing next to the creek. There was a fallen log that made a natural bench and a flat, rocky area where we could spread out our blanket. The sun was filtering through the trees in that perfect way that made everything feel magical. Diana said it looked like something from a fairy tale. We ate lunch, and afterward, the kids wanted to play by the creek. The water was cold, but they took off their shoes and rolled up their pants to wade at the edge. Diana was taking pictures with her phone, and I was just sitting on the log, enjoying the moment and watching the kids splash each other. That's when everything changed. I've been in forests my whole life. I hunt, I fish, I've camped in some pretty remote places, but I've never experienced anything like what happened next. First, it was the silence. If you spend time in the woods, you know they're never actually quiet. There's always birds chirping, squirrels rustling in the leaves, the sound of the wind in the trees. But suddenly, everything just stopped. No birds, no insects buzzing, nothing. Just the sound of the creek water. I remember looking at Diana, and she'd noticed it too. She had this confused look on her face. I called the kids to come back from the creek, trying to keep my voice casual. I didn't want to scare them, but something felt wrong. That's when we heard it, a scream unlike anything I've ever heard before. It wasn't human, but it wasn't like any animal I know either. It was deep and powerful, but with this high-pitched quality that sent shivers down my spine. It echoed through the trees, making it hard to tell exactly where it came from. But it was definitely deeper in the forest. Away from the trail, the kids froze in the creek. Emma's face went white. Tyler started crying immediately. Diana grabbed my arm so hard it left marks. "What was that?" Diana whispered. I didn't have an answer. I told everyone to be quiet, to listen. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then we heard movement. Something big was moving through the forest. Breaking branches, heavy footsteps, and it was moving fast. "Get your shoes," I told the kids, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to go now." They scrambled out of the creek. Diana was already shoving our picnic stuff into the backpack, not even bothering to pack it properly. I was scanning the tree line, trying to see what was coming. That's when a branch, not a twig, but an actual branch, thick as my arm and about 4 feet long, came flying out of the trees and landed with a heavy thud about 10 feet from us. It wasn't thrown randomly. It was thrown at us, deliberately, Tyler screamed. Emma was struggling with her shoes, her hands shaking too hard to tie the laces. Diana grabbed both kids, telling them we'd fix the shoes on the trail. We just needed to move. As we were grabbing the last of our things, I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the trees but clearly visible, was something. Something massive. It had to be over 8 feet tall, broad shoulders, powerful arms that hung longer than a human's should, and it was covered in dark brown hair, not fur exactly, but hair like a human's, but all over its body. I only saw its face partially, a wide, flat nose, deep-set eyes under a prominent brow ridge. But what struck me was how it was breathing, heavy, deliberate breaths that I could hear even from that distance. Our eyes met for a split second. I know that sounds crazy, but they did, and in that moment I felt something I've never felt before. A primal fear, like my ancestors must have felt when faced with a predator they couldn't fight. It let out another scream, louder this time, aggressive. I swear I could feel the sound vibrating in my chest. The ground seemed to shake with it. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing the backpack and pushing my family toward the trail. We ran like hell. I've never been so terrified in my life. The kids were crying. Diana was half carrying Tyler, whose shoes were still untied. Emma was ahead of us, running faster than I'd ever seen her move. Behind us I could hear it. Heavy footsteps, branches breaking. That thing was following us. I kept looking back, expecting to see it right behind us, but it stayed just out of clear view, moving through the trees, parallel to the trail. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses, a massive shape moving with surprising agility through the dense forest. We ran for what felt like forever. My lungs were burning. Tyler had twisted his ankle at some point, but was too scared to slow down. Emma had fallen once, scraping her hands and knees, but got right back up without a word. The footsteps behind us suddenly stopped. We paused for a second, gasping for breath. The silence was back. That unnatural quiet. "Is it gone?" Diana whispered. Then we heard another scream, but farther away this time, like it was calling to something or someone. That's when Emma started tugging frantically at my sleeve. "Daddy," she said, pointing back down the trail with a shaking hand. About 50 yards behind us, it was standing in the middle of the trail, fully visible, massive, muscular, its chest heaving from the chase. I won't ever forget what happened next. It raised one arm and pointed at us, a deliberate human-like gesture. Then it turned and disappeared into the trees. We didn't wait to see what that meant. We ran again, faster than before, if that was possible. The parking lot seemed to take forever to reach. When we finally broke out of the trees, I've never been so happy to see our Honda CR-V in my life. We piled in, me fumbling with the keys so badly that Diana had to take them from my shaking hands to unlock the car. As Diana started the engine, I looked back at the trailhead one last time, and there it was, standing just at the edge of the forest, partially hidden by the trees, but clearly watching us. Even from that distance, I could feel its eyes on us. Diana hit the gas hard, spraying gravel as we tore out of the parking lot. I kept watching out the back window until we couldn't see the trailhead anymore. No one spoke for the first 20 minutes of the drive home. The only sounds were Tyler's quiet sobs and Emma's shaky breathing. Diana's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Finally, Tyler asked in this tiny voice, "Was that a monster, Daddy?" I didn't know what to tell him. I still don't. The aftermath has been tough. The kids had nightmares for weeks. Tyler would wake up screaming that something was outside his window. Emma, who used to love camping and hiking, now refuses to go anywhere near the woods. Diana and I have tried to rationalize what we saw. A bear standing on its hind legs, some kind of elaborate prank, but we know what we saw. I reported it to the park rangers, trying to sound as rational as possible. They took the report politely, but I could tell they thought we'd seen a bear and panicked. Maybe they're right, but bears don't throw branches. They don't point at you. They don't move the way this thing moved. It's been over a year, and I still wake up sometimes hearing that scream in my head. I still feel those eyes watching us. I've always been a skeptic about Sasquatch or Bigfoot or whatever you want to call it. But I know what I saw. The worst part is feeling like our connection with nature, something Diana and I always wanted to foster in our kids, has been damaged. The woods don't feel safe anymore. They feel watched. I don't know if anyone will believe this. I'm not sure I would if someone else told me this story, but I know what my family experienced that day in the Porcupine Mountains, and I know we weren't alone in those woods. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, watching other hikers, other families enjoying a peaceful day in nature, and I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't made it back to our car. Story 9. I've been sitting on this experience for over a decade now, not sure if I should share it publicly. But after watching all these new documentaries and reading everyone's encounters, I figured it's time. I still get goosebumps thinking about it, and honestly, I've never looked at forests the same way since. It all started in early summer of 2012. My buddy Mike and I would go night fishing at this really remote lake in Lolo National Forest in western Montana. We'd been going there for years since it was well off the beaten path. You had to take this unmarked dirt road about 4 miles in, then hike another mile through pretty dense forest. Most people didn't bother, which meant more fish for us. We'd been night fishing there for about 3 weeks straight that summer. The first couple nights were normal, just crickets, occasional owl hoots, nothing unusual. But on the third night, we started hearing these weird noises coming from across the lake. At first I thought it was maybe some campers or other fishermen, but the sounds were different. Hard to describe, but almost like something between a whoop and a grunt. Mike heard it too, so I knew I wasn't imagining things. Then the splashes started. Massive splashes that would echo across the lake. Not like fish jumping. These sounded like someone was throwing refrigerator-sized rocks into the water. The weird thing was, they always came from the opposite shore, maybe half a mile away, too far to see anything even with our flashlights. What the hell is making that noise? I remember asking Mike. He just shrugged and said, probably some drunks messing around. But there were no campfires, no voices, nothing that would indicate people. The splashes and whooping continued on and off for the next few nights, always from the far shore, always after midnight. It got to the point where I was more focused on listening for those sounds than catching fish. Then this severe drought hit Montana that summer. By mid-July, our fishing spot had completely dried up. The lake literally disappeared, leaving nothing but cracked mud and a few sad puddles. We moved on to other spots, but I couldn't shake the memory of those sounds. One night over beers, Mike mentioned something that gave me chills. He said his grandfather, who'd been a forest ranger in that area back in the 70s, had all these stories about strange encounters in those exact woods. Huge footprints, strange howls at night, deer carcasses found in trees, classic Bigfoot stuff that I'd always laughed off before. "You think that's what we were hearing?" I asked, half joking. Mike just took a swig of his beer. "All I know is my grandpa wouldn't go into certain parts of that forest alone. Said there were things in there older than people." That conversation stuck with me. By August, curiosity got the better of me. With the lake dried up, I figured I could actually cross over and check out where those sounds had been coming from. So one Saturday morning, I drove out there alone. It felt different in daylight, less threatening, but still eerily quiet. Walking across the dried lake bed was surreal. Fish bones everywhere. The ground cracked like a giant jigsaw puzzle. When I reached the other side, I immediately noticed something odd. Broken branches on trees, but way higher than a person could reach. I'm 6'1", and these breaks were at least 10 feet up. Some looked twisted off rather than broken. I followed what looked like a rough path into the woods. About a quarter mile in, I stumbled on something that stopped me cold. There was this structure. I hesitate to call it a shelter because it wasn't some flimsy lean-to. This thing was built with full-sized logs, some as thick as my thigh, stacked and woven together in a dome shape. Too sophisticated for kids messing around, too primitive for hunters. It was maybe 7 feet tall at the center and about 12 feet across. My first thought was homeless camp, but this was nearly 5 miles from the nearest road. No trash, no fire pit, nothing to suggest human habitation. Just this massive wooden dome nestled between 3 large pine trees. I took some pictures with my phone, wishing I had brought a better camera. The inside was bare except for this depression in the ground, like something large had been sleeping there. The hairs on my neck were standing up, but I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Following the path further, I came to a small clearing with a depression that had collected rainwater, a natural watering hole. Around it were dozens of animal tracks, but also something else, large bare footprints sunk deep in the mud. They were maybe 15, 16 inches long. I told myself they were probably bear tracks, distorted by rain and mud. But deep down, I knew bear tracks don't look like giant human feet. I snapped more pictures and got the hell out of there. When I showed them to Mike later, he just nodded like he wasn't surprised. Grandpa had pictures like these, he said quietly. Fast forward to September. I'd convinced myself the structure was probably made by some survivalist types, or maybe even Forest Service workers. To prove it to myself, I brought 2 friends out there, Jeff and Danny, who were visiting from Seattle. I wanted witnesses, I guess. We hiked across the dried lake bed and found the structure easily enough. It was still there, but looked maintained. Some of the branches were different, fresher. Jeff, the skeptic of the group, insisted it was just an elaborate hunter's blind, though he couldn't explain why anyone would build something so massive deep in the woods. On our way back, we took a different route and ended up near this old, abandoned graveyard from some long-gone logging settlement. That's when we heard it. This strange chattering sound, almost like speech, but completely unintelligible. It reminded me of the way samurai talk in old Japanese movies. Rapid, harsh syllables. It was coming from a dense thicket about 50 yards away. "Hello?" Jeff called out. Silence. Then the chattering again, this time from a slightly different location, like whatever was making the noise had moved. Danny whispered, "That doesn't sound human." "It's probably just a raccoon or something," I said, not believing it myself. We stood frozen, listening as the chattering faded away. None of us suggested investigating further. We practically jogged back to the car. I couldn't stop thinking about it all winter. By March 2013, the snow had mostly melted, and I was determined to go back, but this time better prepared. I convinced Mike to come along, plus Danny and his brother Ryan, who'd been a Marine and brought his night vision monocular. We arrived at dusk, set up a small camp near where the lake's edge used to be, and waited. Nothing happened until about 2:30 in the morning. We were sitting around a small fire when we heard this deep, resonant groaning sound echo through the trees. Not a bear, not an elk. I've heard both plenty of times. This was different, lower, almost mournful. Ryan immediately grabbed his night vision. "There's something moving out there," he whispered, pointing toward the tree line about 100 yards away. I picked up my flashlight, one of those super bright tactical ones, and swept it across the forest edge. That's when I saw them. 2 reflective eyes, about 50 yards away, positioned maybe 5 or 6 feet off the ground. They weren't like animal eyes that usually glow yellow or red. These reflected a greenish white, and they were wider set than any animal I know. The thing moved. I couldn't see its body clearly, just a large, dark shape that seemed to glide rather than walk. It moved behind a large pine tree, but the eyes remained visible, peering around the trunk. The strangest part? It didn't break eye contact. It was watching us, studying us, intelligent, aware. "What the fuck is that?" Mike whispered, his voice shaking. The eyes disappeared. Ryan claimed he could see it moving away with his night vision. but the rest of us just heard branches softly snapping as it retreated. None of us slept that night. We kept the fire going until dawn, then packed up quickly. But before leaving, I convinced everyone to walk over to where we'd seen the eyes. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there they were, footprints, huge, human-like impressions, at least 16 inches long and incredibly deep, suggesting whatever made them was extremely heavy. Ryan took pictures and even made a quick plaster cast using some repair stuff he had in his truck. The cast didn't turn out great, but it clearly showed toes and a distinct arch, nothing like a bear or any other animal. We came back the next night, which was probably stupid. This time we parked about 2 miles away and hiked in quietly. We never made it to our previous spot. About halfway there, we started hearing movement in the woods parallel to us. Something was keeping pace with us, just out of sight. Branches would crack, then silence, then more movement further ahead, like it was moving alongside us, sometimes circling behind. This continued for nearly a mile. We had flashlights and Ryan's night vision, but never got a clear look at whatever was following us. Then suddenly, everything went silent. The normal forest sounds, insects, wind in the trees, all stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the sounds had been. "We need to leave, now." Ryan's tone left no room for argument. We turned around and walked quickly back to the truck, feeling watched the entire way. That was my last trip deep into those woods. I've gone back to the main roads a few times since, but never felt comfortable venturing far from the car. When people ask why, I make up excuses about ticks or mountain lions. Looking back at everything, the rock throws in the lake, the massive shelter, branches broken way too high, those eyes making direct contact, the bizarre chatter and the footprints. I'm convinced we encountered Sasquatch, not just once, but repeatedly over those months. My theory is they had a territory around that lake, and when the drought dried up their water source, they became more active, maybe searching for new habitat. I still have the pictures and Ryan's plaster cast somewhere in storage. Sometimes I think about digging them out, maybe sending them to one of those Bigfoot research groups. But then I remember those eyes watching us, that intelligent gaze, and I wonder if some things are better left alone. I don't tell this story often. Most people just think you're crazy or making it up. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. There's something out there in those woods that science hasn't acknowledged yet. And honestly, I'm okay with science taking its time figuring it out. Some mysteries probably should stay mysterious. Story 10. I've been debating for years whether to share this. Every time I start typing, I delete everything and walk away. But I need to get this off my chest, and I figure this is probably the safest place to do it. I know how this sounds, believe me. If someone told me this story before it happened to me, I'd think they were full of crap or needed medication. This happened back in the winter of 2005 to 2006, when my family and I were living near Coston, British Columbia. It's a small, quiet area tucked away by the riverside, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and most weekends are spent outdoors. My wife, my 16-year-old son Jake, and I had moved there about a year earlier from Vancouver, looking for a slower pace and more nature. The first incident happened in late December 2005. It was unseasonably warm that day, maybe about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and we decided to take advantage of the weather by hiking one of our favorite trails that followed the river. Nothing fancy, just a simple path through the woods that locals used for fishing spots. We'd been walking for maybe 30 minutes when we reached this clearing where you could see across to the other side of the river. The water was low that time of year, creating these shallow areas with small islands of stones and sand. I remember pausing to take a drink from my water bottle when something caught my eye across the water. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, About 300 meters away, standing in the shallow part of the river, were 4 black shapes. And when I say black, I mean completely, utterly black, like voids against the landscape. 2 of them were standing upright, while the other 2 were bent over like they were drinking from the river. "Hey," I said to my wife and Jake, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you see that, over there in the river?" They both squinted in the direction I was pointing. Jake saw them immediately. My wife took a moment longer. "What are those?" she whispered. "Bears." But they weren't bears. I've seen plenty of bears in my life, and these weren't bears. They were too tall, too human-like, but not human either. The proportions were all wrong. Their arms hung too low, their shoulders too broad, their heads seemingly attached directly to their torsos without much of a neck, and they were massive. Even from that distance, I could tell they were huge. "Dad, those are standing up," Jake said, his voice cracking slightly. "Bears don't stand like that." He was right. The 2 upright figures were standing perfectly straight like humans, but much taller than any person I'd ever seen. They had to be at least 8 or 9 feet tall, and there was something about the way they moved, deliberate, almost graceful despite their size. We watched them for maybe 2 minutes, none of us speaking. I fumbled for my phone to take a picture, but in my nervousness, I realized I'd left it in the car. Jake had his, but by the time he got it out and zoomed in, the figures had started to move away from the water's edge, heading toward the tree line on the far bank. "We need to get closer," I said, suddenly desperate to confirm what we were seeing. "Let's drive around to the other side." We practically jogged back to our SUV and spent the next 20 minutes driving around, trying to find road access to that part of the river. But the roads there are confusing if you don't know them well, and we kept hitting dead ends or private property. By the time we made it back to our original viewing spot, whatever we'd seen was gone. On the drive home, we tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were people in dark fishing waders, but why would they be completely black from head to toe? And the size, they were enormous. Maybe some kind of moose or elk standing strangely, but the upright posture and movements were unmistakably bipedal. Jake was the first one to say what we were all thinking. "Those were Sasquatch, weren't they?" he said quietly from the back seat. My wife and I exchanged glances. I'm a practical person. I work in construction management. I deal with tangible things, measurements, facts. I don't go in for supernatural explanations. But what we'd seen defied ordinary explanation. "I don't know what they were," I answered honestly. That night, Jake went online and showed us some supposed Sasquatch footage. I'd always dismissed that stuff as hoaxes, but now I couldn't help noticing similarities to what we'd seen. Still, I tried to stay rational. One strange sighting didn't mean anything. It could have been a trick of the light or some explanation we hadn't thought of. Then came January 2nd, 2006. It was a cold, clear day, with about 6 inches of fresh snow on the ground. After being cooped up indoors for New Year's due to bad weather, we were eager to get out. We decided to try a different trail, one that branched off from a gravel forestry road about 15 miles from our house. We arrived at the trailhead around 2 in the afternoon. The sun was already starting to lower in the winter sky, but we still had a good 3 hours of daylight left. I parked the SUV at the small clearing that served as a makeshift parking area, and we started getting our gear ready. That's when we heard it. The sound came from the dense woods to our right, maybe 100 yards away. It started as a low moan that quickly rose into a high-pitched, almost desperate screaming. It wasn't a continuous sound, but came in bursts, 3 or 4 seconds of this awful wailing, then silence for a few seconds, then another wail. I've lived in rural areas most of my life. I've heard coyotes, wolves, mountain lions, bears, elk, all kinds of wildlife sounds. This wasn't anything like that. It was too powerful, too intentional. My wife grabbed my arm so hard it left marks. Jake had gone completely pale. "Dad," he whispered, "that sounds exactly like those Sasquatch recordings online." He was right. The screams had this deep guttural quality underneath the high-pitched wailing, like it was coming from something with a massive chest cavity. It reminded me of a person trying to scream with their voice breaking, but amplified 10 times louder than any human could possibly manage. We stood frozen by the car, listening as the screams continued. They seemed to be moving, circling around to the left of us, getting closer. My wife, who's usually the calmest of us all, suddenly reached through the open window and hit the car horn. The blaring horn cut through the forest, and immediately the screaming stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. We could feel eyes on us, watching from the tree line. "Get in the car," I said quietly. "Now." We piled in, and I started the engine, but instead of leaving immediately, some compulsion made me drive slowly down the gravel road, in the direction the screaming had been moving. About a quarter-mile down, the road cut through a small clearing covered in pristine snow. That's where we saw the tracks. They crossed the road from one side to the other, a single line of enormous footprints pressed deep into the snow. I stopped the car and, against my better judgment, got out to look. My wife hissed at me to get back in, but I needed to see this. The prints were huge, easily 20 inches long and 10 inches wide. The stride between them was impossibly long, maybe 5 or 6 feet apart. No human could make steps that far apart, especially in deep snow. And the depth of the impressions suggested something incredibly heavy. The tracks came out from the trees on one side of the road, crossed the gravel, and continued into the deeper snow among the trees on the other side. I followed them with my eyes as far as I could see, noting how they maintained a perfectly straight line, purposeful and direct. Jake had gotten out too and was staring at the tracks in disbelief. He knelt down next to one and placed his hand inside the impression. His entire hand and forearm disappeared into the depth of it. "Dad," he started, then seemed unable to continue. I took out my phone this time and snapped several pictures of the footprints. Then I placed my boot next to one for scale. My size 11 boot looked like a child's footprint next to it. The sound of a branch snapping deep in the woods made us both look up sharply. It could have been anything. A heavy clump of snow falling, an animal moving through the brush. But in that moment, with those tracks in front of us and the memory of those screams still ringing in our ears, it felt like a warning. "Back to the car. Now," I said, and this time there was no hesitation. We drove home in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. That night I uploaded the photos to my computer and studied them for hours. There was no doubt in my mind that what we had encountered, both that day and by the river previously, was something not officially recognized by science. The next day, I called a friend who worked for the Forestry Service and described what we'd seen, without mentioning Sasquatch. He suggested bears walking on hind legs or possibly moose. But when I sent him the footprint photos, he went quiet. Eventually he said, "I don't know what to tell you, man. Those aren't from any animal I'm familiar with." We went back a week later with a video camera, hoping to document more evidence, but the snow had melted enough that the tracks were gone. We tried several more times over the following months to return to the spot where we'd seen the 4 figures by the river, but never saw anything unusual again. I've replayed those 2 encounters in my mind thousands of times since then. I've considered every possible explanation, every rational alternative, but I keep coming back to the same conclusion. We encountered something in those woods that most people believe is just a legend. The thing that haunts me most isn't the size of those tracks or even the inhuman screaming. It's the intelligence I sensed behind it all, the way the screaming seemed to circle us, the perfectly straight line of tracks, the deliberate way those black figures moved by the river. Whatever we encountered, it was aware of us. It was watching us, and it was smart enough to stay hidden from most humans most of the time. I don't know why we were lucky or unlucky enough to witness it twice. Sometimes I wonder if it revealed itself intentionally, for reasons I can't understand. All I know is that I'll never look at the forests of British Columbia the same way again. I still have the photos of those tracks on an old hard drive. Sometimes I take them out and look at them, just to remind myself that I didn't imagine it all. But I've never shown them to anyone outside my immediate family. Until now, I've never even told this story in full. I guess I'm still afraid of the ridicule, or maybe of something else. Something I can't quite put into words. Story 11. I can't believe I'm finally writing this down. It's been over 10 years, and I still get chills thinking about what happened that day. You can call me Dan. I'm not usually the type to share personal stuff online, but I need to get this off my chest. And honestly, I don't know where else to turn. Back in the summer of 2012, I was going through a rough patch. My girlfriend of 3 years had just broken things off, and I'd been laid off from my construction job. I needed to clear my head, so I decided to do what I always did when life got overwhelming. Go fishing. I live in southwest Montana, about 40 minutes from Beaver Head Deer Lodge National Forest. There's this small lake tucked away there. I'm not going to share the exact location because I don't want anyone else experiencing what I did. Let's just call it Beaver Lake. It was my go-to spot when I wanted solitude. You had to hike about a mile from the nearest parking area, so it rarely saw other fishermen, especially on weekdays. It was a Tuesday in mid-July, hot but not unbearable. I remember because I checked the weather that morning. Clear skies, high of 82 degrees, perfect fishing weather. I packed light, my favorite rod, a small tackle box, some sandwiches, and a 6-pack of beer. Left home around 5 in the morning, wanting to get there for the early bite. The drive was peaceful, just me and my thoughts, with some old Merle Haggard playing on the radio. I parked at the small lot where the trail begins, grabbed my gear, and started the hike in. The morning air was still cool, and the forest was alive with sounds, birds calling, the occasional rustle in the underbrush, nothing out of the ordinary. I'd made this same trip probably 30 times before. I reached the lake around 6:30. The water was like glass, reflecting the surrounding pines and the blue sky above. I set up at my usual spot, a small clearing on the eastern shore with a fallen log that made for a perfect seat. From there, I had a good cast into the deeper part of the lake, where the base usually hung out. For the first hour or so, everything was normal. I caught a couple of decent-sized bass, nothing spectacular, but enough to keep me interested. I was targeting them with a plastic worm rig, my go-to for that lake. Around 8 o'clock, things started getting weird. I'd cast out, let the bait sink, and then feel a subtle tug. Not the distinct strike of a bass, but something more deliberate. I'd reel in, and my worm would be gone. This happened 3 times in a row. At first, I thought maybe there was some clever sunfish stealing my bait, but it felt different somehow. While I was re-rigging for the 4th time, I noticed something odd in the tree line across the lake. A branch moved, not like it was swaying in the wind. There wasn't any wind that morning. It moved down and then back up, like something had pulled it. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but didn't see anything else. I shrugged it off and went back to fishing. About 20 minutes later, I felt something bump against my leg in the water. I jerked back and saw a water snake swimming away, about 2 feet long, probably a common garter snake. I'm not usually spooked by snakes, but this one had startled me. Without really thinking, I grabbed my fishing net and scooped it out of the water. Looking back now, I wish I'd just let it go, but I was annoyed at having my peaceful morning disturbed, and something primitive took over. I grabbed a rock from the shoreline and killed it with a couple of blows to the head. I tossed its body back into the water and watched it float away. That's when everything changed. Not even 30 seconds after the snake's body disappeared beneath the surface, I heard the most violent splash I've ever heard on that lake. About 20 yards to my right, a rock the size of a basketball crashed into the water. Before I could even process what happened, another one hit the water to my left, even closer this time, sending spray all over me. Someone was throwing rocks at me. That was my first thought. Maybe some kids playing a prank, or another fisherman pissed that I'd taken the good spot. I jumped to my feet, anger rising in my chest. "Hey!" I yelled, spinning around to face the woods behind me. "What the hell do you think you're—" The words died in my throat. At the edge of the tree line, maybe 40 yards away, stood something I still struggle to describe. My brain first registered it as a bear. We get them out here, and my first instinct was to look for an escape route. But bears don't stand upright for that long, and bears don't have shoulders that wide. This thing, this creature, stood at least 7 feet tall. Its shoulders must have been 5 feet across, with arms that hung down to its knees. It was covered in thick, dark brown hair, not fur but hair, that moved slightly in the morning breeze. Its chest was massive, barrel-shaped, tapering to a narrower waist. The proportions were all wrong for a human, too powerful, too primal. I couldn't make out its face clearly from that distance, thank God, but I could see it was watching me, studying me. I was frozen, my fishing rod still clutched in my hand, unable to move or speak or even think clearly. Then it screamed. I've heard elk bugle, cougars scream, bears roar. Nothing compares to the sound that came out of that creature. It started as a deep, guttural growl that you could feel in your chest, then rose to a pitch that seemed impossible for something that size. It wasn't just loud, it was physically painful, like the sound was drilling into my skull. I actually dropped to one knee, my hands instinctively moving to cover my ears. The scream lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When it stopped, the forest went completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing, just me and this thing staring at each other across the clearing. For what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, we just looked at each other. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I was about to die and no one would ever find my body. My truck would sit in that parking lot until the rangers got suspicious. But by then, there would be nothing left of me. Then, without warning, the creature turned and moved back into the forest. I say moved because ran doesn't quite capture it. It was incredibly fast, but also smooth, covering ground in a way that seemed impossible for something so large. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, swallowed by the trees. All that remained was the swaying of branches where it had passed. I didn't wait around to see if it would come back. I abandoned most of my gear, just grabbed my keys and wallet from where I'd set them on the log and ran. I ran the entire mile back to my truck without stopping once, fueled by pure adrenaline. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me convinced it was right behind me. When I finally reached my truck, I fumbled with the keys so badly I dropped them twice before managing to unlock the door. I peeled out of that parking lot, spraying gravel, and didn't slow down until I hit the main highway. It took me almost a week to work up the courage to tell anyone what happened. I finally confided in my brother, who just laughed and suggested I'd had too much sun or maybe drunk one too many beers. After his reaction, I didn't tell anyone else for years. But I know what I saw, and I've spent countless hours researching since then. I know now that what I encountered was what some people call Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I've read enough accounts from others to recognize the patterns, the rock throwing, the screams, the incredible speed for something so large. What haunts me most is the timing. It wasn't until I killed that snake that the creature revealed itself, like it had been watching me the whole time, assessing me, maybe even curious about me. And when it saw what I did to that snake, something changed. I crossed some line I didn't know existed. I haven't been back to Beaver Lake since that day. Haven't been fishing much at all, to be honest. Every time I think about grabbing my gear and heading out, I remember that scream, that impossible sound that seemed to reach inside me and squeeze my organs. I remember those eyes watching me from a face I couldn't quite see, and I'm grateful for that small mercy. Sometimes at night, when I'm on the edge of sleep, I hear that scream again. It jolts me awake, heart racing, sheets soaked with sweat. My girlfriend, different one obviously, says I talk in my sleep sometimes, trying to apologize to something or someone. I don't know if it was the snake that triggered the creature's anger, or if it would have revealed itself anyway. I don't know if it meant to harm me or just warn me. All I know is that there are things in those woods that most people will never see, and maybe that's for the best. If you're still reading this, you probably think I'm crazy or making this up. I don't blame you. I would have thought the same before that day, but I know what I saw, and I know that somewhere in the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest, there's a creature that remembers me too. I just hope our paths never cross again. Story 12. I've debated posting this for years, wondering if anyone would believe me, or if I'd get the same dismissive reactions I got as a kid. But after browsing through so many of your experiences, I finally feel like this might be the one place where people will take me seriously. This happened back when I was 5 years old. I remember my age specifically because it was the summer before kindergarten, and my mom kept talking about how I'd be starting real school soon. We were staying at my grandparents' house in rural Tennessee for a couple weeks. Their property was pretty isolated, about 15 acres, with woods surrounding 3 sides and a small creek running through the back. The nearest neighbor was maybe half a mile down the dirt road. It was late afternoon, probably around 4 or 5 o'clock. The day had been hot and humid, the kind where your clothes stick to your skin and breathing feels like drinking soup. My grandfather had the air conditioning on, but it was one of those window units that only really cooled one room, so they'd opened the screen door to get a cross breeze. I remember the screen door clearly. It had a slight tear in the bottom corner where their old cat had clawed it, and it made this distinctive creaking sound whenever someone opened it. I was sitting on the living room floor playing with this set of wooden blocks my grandfather had made for me. They were painted primary colors, red, blue, yellow, and I was building what I thought was a castle, but probably looked more like a lopsided pile. My grandfather was napping on the couch behind me, snoring softly. I could hear my mom and grandmother in the kitchen, the steady rhythm of cards being dealt, and their quiet conversation punctuated by occasional laughter. That's when I felt it, that weird, prickly feeling on the back of your neck when someone's watching you. You know that feeling, right? Even as a kid, I recognized it. I looked up from my blocks, and my eyes went straight to the screen door. There was something standing there. Someone, just on the other side of the screen, perfectly still, watching me. At first, I thought it might be one of the neighbor kids, though I don't know why I thought that since we rarely saw them. But within seconds, I realized this was nothing like any kid I'd ever seen. It was about my height, maybe 4 feet tall. Its body was covered in reddish-brown fur that looked patchy and uneven, like it had been cut badly in some places. The face is what I remember most vividly. It was flat, almost like it had been pressed against a window, with a wide nose and dark eyes set deep in their sockets. Those eyes, they weren't angry or threatening, but they were intense, alert, focused entirely on me. Its shoulders were wider than a kid's should be, and its arms looked thick and strong. They hung at its sides, and I could see that its hands were large with long fingers. It wasn't wearing clothes, but the fur covered everything. The strangest part, I wasn't scared, not even a little bit. Looking back now, I should have been terrified, but in that moment it felt, I don't know, natural, like seeing a deer in the yard or something. There was just this overwhelming sense of curiosity coming from both of us. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds or so. Neither of us moved. Neither of us made a sound. Just 2 kids, I realize now, taking each other in. Then, without really thinking about it, I stood up and walked toward the screen door, my blocks forgotten on the floor behind me. I remember the feeling of the cool hardwood under my bare feet as I crossed the living room. My grandfather continued snoring on the couch, completely oblivious. I stopped about 3 feet from the door, close enough that I could see the details of its face more clearly. Its eyes were dark brown, almost black, with no whites visible. Its nose was wide and flat with large nostrils. I couldn't see a mouth at first, but when it tilted its head slightly to the side, like a dog does when it's confused, I could see that its mouth was small compared to the rest of its face. The whole time, it never blinked. At least, I don't remember it blinking. And it never made a sound. No breathing, no grunting, nothing. Just silent observation. I don't know why, but I lifted my hand in a small wave. The creature didn't wave back, but its head tilted a bit more, and I swear I saw its eyes narrow slightly, like it was trying to understand what I was doing. After another moment of this silent exchange, I decided to get my grandmother, not because I was scared, but because I wanted to show her the interesting visitor we had. I turned and walked to the kitchen, tugging on her sleeve as she held her cards. "Grandma," I said, "there's somebody at the door." She looked down at me, annoyed at the interruption. "What do you mean, Emma? Did someone knock?" "No," I replied. "They're just standing there watching me." "Come see." My mom and grandmother exchanged one of those adult looks, the kind that says, kids and their imagination without words. But my grandmother put down her cards and followed me back to the living room. "See?" I said, pointing to the screen door. But there was nothing there. The space where the creature had stood was empty, just the front yard, the gravel driveway, and beyond that, the edge of the woods. "Emma," my grandmother sighed, "don't make up stories. Your mother and I are in the middle of our game." "But it was there," I insisted. "It was furry and brown, and it was watching me." My mother had followed us into the living room by this point. "Honey, it was probably just a shadow or maybe one of the neighbor's dogs. Nothing to worry about." I knew it wasn't a dog. I knew what dogs looked like, and this wasn't one. But I also knew that tone in my mother's voice, the one that meant the conversation was over, so I went back to my blocks, occasionally glancing at the screen door, hoping the creature would return. It didn't. That night at dinner, I tried to tell my grandfather about it. He was always more patient with my stories. "It had fur all over," I explained, waving my fork for emphasis, "and big dark eyes." "Sounds like you saw a bear cub," he chuckled. "It wasn't a bear," I said firmly. "It stood up like a person." My mother shot me that look again. "Emma, enough with the stories. Eat your dinner." I knew they wouldn't believe me, so I stopped talking about it. But I didn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky pink and orange. Everyone else was still asleep. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake my mother, who was sleeping in the twin bed across the room, and tiptoed to the living room. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirping of birds outside. I went to the screen door and looked out at the spot where the creature had stood. The grass there was slightly flattened, as if something had indeed been standing there, but that could have been from anything. I had an idea. I ran back to the bedroom and grabbed one of my small plastic dinosaurs, a triceratops that was my second favorite. I wouldn't risk my favorite T-Rex. Back at the screen door, I carefully pushed it open, wincing at the creaking sound, and stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards were cool under my feet, still damp with morning dew. I walked down the 3 porch steps and across the yard to the exact spot where I'd seen the creature. There, I placed my triceratops in the grass, positioning it so it was standing upright facing the woods. "This is for you," I whispered, though I don't know why I thought the creature would hear me or even come back. "If you want to be friends." Then I went back inside, had breakfast with my family, and spent the morning watching cartoons and coloring. Around lunchtime, I remembered my dinosaur and went to check on it. It was gone. I searched the entire yard, thinking maybe the wind had blown it away or an animal had moved it, but the Triceratops had vanished completely. I never found it again, not during that visit or any future trips to my grandparents' house. When I told my mother that my toy was missing, she assumed I'd lost it somewhere in the house or yard. She didn't connect it to my imaginary visitor from the day before. No one did. Years passed. I grew up. My grandparents eventually sold that house and moved into a retirement community closer to town. I went to college, got a job, started building my own life, but I never forgot that encounter. Then, about 3 years ago, I fell down an internet rabbit hole researching Sasquatch accounts. It started as casual curiosity after watching a documentary, but soon I was reading everything I could find, and that's when I came across descriptions and accounts that made my blood run cold. Stories of juvenile Bigfoot creatures, smaller than adults, with reddish-brown fur and curious dispositions. Some researchers believe that young Sasquatch are more likely to approach human habitations out of curiosity, especially if children are present. They seem drawn to kids, perhaps recognizing something familiar in them, despite the obvious differences. The more I read, the more convinced I became that what I'd seen that summer day wasn't imagination or a neighbor's dog or a bear cub. It was a young Sasquatch, probably about my age at the time, drawn by the sight of another child playing inside this strange structure. I wonder sometimes what happened to my Triceratops. Did the creature take it as a gift? Did it become a prized possession, a strange artifact from the human world? Or was it simply a curious object to be examined and then discarded? I also wonder if that young Sasquatch remembers me as clearly as I remember it. If somewhere in the forests of Tennessee, there's an adult Bigfoot that occasionally thinks about the small human girl who waved at it through a screen door one hot summer day. I've never told this story publicly before today. My family still doesn't believe me, and I've learned not to bring it up. But I know what I saw. I know it was real. And now, 27 years later, I still find myself glancing at screen doors on summer afternoons, half expecting to see those deep, curious eyes staring back at me. Story 13. I've been debating whether to share this for months now. I'm not the type to seek attention or make up stories, but what I experienced last September has been eating away at me, and I need to get it off my chest. I've always been skeptical about cryptid sightings and Bigfoot stories, but now, well, I don't know what to believe anymore. I'm an avid kayaker and have been exploring the lakes of northern Minnesota for over 15 years. There's something peaceful about being alone on the water, especially in late September when all the summer tourists have gone home and nature reclaims its quiet. That particular morning started like any other solo trip. The weather forecast predicted clear skies, but as I drove to the lake, a heavy fog had settled over the area. I almost turned back. Fog on an unfamiliar lake can be dangerous, but something told me to continue. I wish I had listened to my first instinct. I arrived at Blackwater Lake around 7 in the morning. The parking lot was completely empty, which wasn't surprising given it was a Tuesday in late September. I unloaded my kayak, a 12-foot Wilderness Systems Pungo I'd saved up for 3 years to buy, and gathered my gear. Just the essentials, my waterproof bag with snacks, water, first aid kit, and my phone sealed in a waterproof case. I also brought my Nikon camera, since I enjoy wildlife photography, though the fog made me doubt I'd get any good shots that day. The lake was eerily still as I pushed off from the shore. The fog created this strange acoustic bubble where sound seemed both muffled and amplified at the same time. Every drip from my paddle echoed slightly, and occasionally I'd hear a fish jump somewhere in the distance. The visibility was poor, maybe 30 feet in front of me at best, but I knew the general layout of the lake from previous visits and decided to stick close to the shoreline. For about an hour, I paddled leisurely along the eastern shore, occasionally stopping to listen to the birds or watch the fog swirl around my kayak. Around 8:30, the fog began to lift slightly, revealing more of the lake and the dense forest that surrounded it. I decided to explore a small cove I'd never visited before, a secluded area on the northern end that required navigating around a narrow peninsula. As I rounded the bend into the cove, the fog had thinned enough that I could see about 100 yards ahead. That's when I noticed movement on the opposite shore. My first thought was bear. Black bears are common in the area, and I'd spotted them before on my trips. I immediately stopped paddling and let my kayak drift silently. Even though bears are generally not a threat if you keep your distance, I didn't want to attract attention. I squinted through the remaining wisps of fog, trying to get a better look. Something felt off. The way it moved wasn't right for a bear. Bears have this rolling gait when they walk, and this creature was more upright, but not moving exactly like a human either. It had a sort of hunched posture, but was definitely on two legs. My heart started beating faster, and I felt that primal instinct that something wasn't normal. I carefully reached for my binoculars in my dry bag, trying not to make any sudden movements. As I brought them up to my eyes and adjusted the focus, my hands started trembling. What I saw through those lenses has haunted me ever since. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume. It was massive, easily 7 to 8 feet tall, with incredibly broad shoulders and arms that seemed disproportionately long, hanging almost to its knees. Its entire body was covered in dark brown fur that looked matted in places. The face was partially obscured from my angle, but I could see enough to know it was flat and wide, with a pronounced brow ridge. Just as I was processing what I was looking at, a second, smaller figure emerged from the tree line. This one was maybe half the size of the first, with lighter reddish-brown hair covering its body. The movement was more agile, almost playful as it cautiously approached the water's edge. I realized with a shock that I was looking at a juvenile, a child of whatever these creatures were. My mouth went dry. I remained frozen, afraid that the slightest movement would give away my position. I was maybe 100 yards from them, partially concealed by the remaining fog and some overhanging branches near the shoreline, but I felt completely exposed. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The smaller one crouched down at the water's edge and began to scoop something from the shore, water maybe, or stones. It then looked back at the larger creature, almost like a child seeking approval from a parent. The interaction was so human-like, yet completely alien at the same time. Then the adult, I assume it was the parent, made a sound I'll never forget. It wasn't quite a growl or a grunt. It was a deep, rumbling vocalization that seemed to vibrate through the air and across the water. I could almost feel it in my chest, like when you stand too close to a subwoofer. It wasn't particularly loud, but it carried power, and I somehow knew instinctively that it was a warning or command. The effect on the younger one was immediate. It stood up straight, stepped back from the water, and returned to the adult's side. Both creatures then turned and looked directly into the forest behind them, as if they'd heard something I couldn't. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a third, even larger figure deeper in the trees, but the fog and distance made it impossible to be certain. In a matter of seconds, both creatures melted back into the forest with surprising grace for their size. One moment they were there, and the next they were gone, leaving nothing but slightly disturbed foliage in their wake. The silence that followed was deafening. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in my kayak. Minutes, maybe an hour. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I'd just witnessed. Bears walking on hind legs, people in suits playing an elaborate prank. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. The fluid movement, the proportions, the vocalization. No costume could replicate that, and no human could achieve that size or move that way through thick forest without making a sound. When I finally regained my composure, my first instinct was to paddle closer to investigate the shore where they had been standing, but fear kept me in place. What if they were still watching? What if there were more of them? The thought of potentially aggravating a family of these creatures kept me firmly in the middle of the cove. Instead, I fumbled for my phone, intending to take pictures of the shoreline or any evidence they might have left behind. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it in the water. When I finally got the camera open, I realized the distance and remaining fog would make any photos useless. Besides, they were already gone. I remember checking the time. It was just after 9 in the morning. The whole encounter had lasted maybe 3 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. My heart was still pounding, and I felt lightheaded from the adrenaline. I decided to leave. Now. I turned my kayak around and paddled back toward the main lake, with more speed than caution, constantly glancing over my shoulder. As I rounded the peninsula back into the main body of the lake, something strange happened. The fog, which had been lifting earlier, suddenly thickened again. Within minutes, visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet, and I found myself enveloped in a cloud of white. Disoriented and still shaken, I had to stop and use the compass on my phone to ensure I was heading in the right direction. That's when I heard it again. That deep, rumbling sound, but much closer this time. It seemed to come from all around me in the fog, impossible to pinpoint. I froze, paddle half raised out of the water, listening intently. Then came a different sound, a series of wood knocks, 3 in rapid succession from the direction of the shore. Seconds later, similar knocks answered from the opposite direction. They were communicating. They were surrounding me. I've never paddled so fast in my life. I didn't care about noise or splashing anymore. I just needed to get back to the boat launch. My arms burned and my breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed through the water, using the compass to maintain my course. Occasionally, I'd hear more of those wood knocks, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always keeping pace with me. After what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes, the familiar outline of the boat launch appeared through the fog. I practically crashed my kayak into the shore in my hurry to get out. As I dragged it onto land, I glanced back at the lake. The fog was starting to lift again, and for a split second, I thought I saw a large, dark figure standing at the tree line across the narrow bay, watching me. When I blinked, it was gone. My hands shook so badly, I could barely tie my kayak to the roof of my car. I kept looking around, feeling exposed and vulnerable. The parking lot was still empty, no witnesses, no help if I needed it. I threw my gear into the trunk haphazardly and got in my car, locking the doors immediately. I sat there for several minutes, trying to calm my breathing and process what had happened. As I was about to start the engine, I noticed something on my kayak through the windshield. At first, I thought it was just water or mud splashed up during my frantic return, but when I got out to check, my blood ran cold. There were 3 distinct marks dragged through the mud on the side of my kayak, 3 parallel lines about an inch apart, too deliberate to be random scratches. They hadn't been there when I started my trip. I got back in my car and drove away, probably faster than was safe on those winding forest roads. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something massive step out onto the road behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the gas station 30 miles away, where I finally felt safe enough to pull over and try to make sense of what had happened. It's been 4 months, and I still haven't gone back to Blackwater Lake. I haven't told many people about what I saw. Who would believe me? I've spent countless hours researching Bigfoot sightings in northern Minnesota, finding that there have been dozens of reports in that general area over the years. Some descriptions match exactly what I saw: the height, the long arms, the reddish-brown juveniles. I know what I saw wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a suit. It was something that shouldn't exist according to science, yet I saw it with my own eyes. A family of creatures living quietly in the forests, revealing themselves only when they think they're alone. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, hearing that rumbling sound in my dreams. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my house, I hear what sounds like 3 knocks coming from outside my window. I tell myself it's just the branches of the oak tree, but deep down, I wonder if they somehow followed me home, if they somehow know who I am and where I live. I haven't been kayaking since that day. I'm not sure I ever will again. Story. I've been hesitating to share this for almost 20 years now. My husband Howard and I have only told close family members, and even then, we've been met with skeptical glances and concerned looks that suggested we needed psychological help. But I know what I saw. I know what happened that night in August 2005, and I need to get this off my chest. Howard had just retired from 42 years at the lumber mill, and I had wrapped up my career as a nurse a few months earlier. We decided to treat ourselves to an extended stay at our lake house near Lake Nipissing in Ontario. We'd owned this place for nearly 15 years, but had never stayed longer than a weekend due to our work schedules. We were excited to finally enjoy it properly, fishing, reading on the porch, and simply enjoying the peaceful surroundings. The lake house wasn't anything fancy, just a modest 2-bedroom cabin about 70 yards from the shoreline, surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides. The nearest neighbor was about half a mile away, which was precisely what we loved about it. The isolation, the quiet, the stars at night. Little did we know that this isolation would become our worst nightmare. The first 2 days were absolutely perfect. Howard caught a decent-sized bass that we grilled for dinner. I collected wild blueberries that grew along the property edge. We sat on the porch each evening, watching the sunset reflect off the lake while sipping our tea. It was exactly the retirement we had dreamed about. On the 3rd day, I noticed something odd in the afternoon. The birds had stopped singing. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe a hawk was circling overhead, causing the smaller birds to go quiet. But then I realized it wasn't just the birds. The entire forest had fallen silent. No squirrels chattering, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing. Just this heavy, oppressive silence that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Howard," I said, "do you notice anything strange?" He looked up from his crossword puzzle, glancing around. "What do you mean?" "Listen. Just listen." He set his pen down and tilted his head. After a few seconds, his expression changed. "Where'd all the critters go?" "I don't know," I replied, wrapping my cardigan tighter around myself despite the warm August air. "It's been like this for about 20 minutes now." Howard shrugged it off. "Probably just a bear wandering through. Everything goes quiet when a predator's around." That explanation made sense, and I tried to accept it. But something deep in my gut told me this wasn't normal. I've spent enough time in the woods to know the difference between the temporary hush that falls when a predator passes through and this unnatural silence that seemed to swallow everything. As evening approached, we moved inside to prepare dinner. The silence outside persisted. I kept glancing out the windows as I chopped vegetables, half expecting to see a bear or maybe a wolf at the tree line. But there was nothing, just the darkening woods and that eerie stillness. We sat down to eat around 7:30. Howard had just taken his first bite when we heard it, a deep, guttural roar that echoed through the trees. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever heard before. It was powerful, angry, and it made the windows vibrate. Howard froze, fork halfway to his mouth. "What the hell was that?" Before I could answer, it came again, louder this time and closer. The sound was primal, almost prehistoric. My hands started shaking so badly that I dropped my fork, the clatter against my plate sounding obscenely loud in our silent kitchen. "Eleanor," Howard said quietly, setting his fork down, "go check that the back door is locked while I get the front." We moved quickly, checking every door and window in the house. As I was securing the last window in the guest bedroom, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of branches snapping. Something was moving through the forest toward our house, and whatever it was massive. The footfalls were heavy enough that I could feel slight vibrations through the floorboards. "Howard!" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. He appeared in the doorway, his face pale. "I know, I hear it too. I've turned on all the outside lights." We retreated to the living room, which faced the lake rather than the forest. Howard grabbed the fireplace poker, a laughably inadequate weapon against whatever was approaching, but it was all we had. We didn't own a gun. We'd never felt the need for one. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by more branch snapping and that terrible, rumbling growl. Then, suddenly, the entire house shook as something slammed against the rear wall with tremendous force. I screamed, unable to help myself. Howard stumbled forward, catching himself on the coffee table. "Get down!" he shouted, pulling me to the floor beside him. Another impact rocked the house, this one against the side wall near the kitchen. We could hear the wooden boards creaking in protest. Whatever was hitting our home had incredible strength. I was sobbing now, convinced we were going to die. The attacks continued, methodical, powerful blows that seemed to be testing the structure of our house for weaknesses. Then the roaring started again, so close and so loud that I had to cover my ears. It was filled with rage and territorial fury. Between impacts, we could hear it circling the house, breathing heavily, occasionally scraping against the siding. "What is it?" I whispered to Howard, my voice trembling uncontrollably. He shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know, Ellie. I don't know." After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 5 or 6 minutes, there was a momentary lull. The creature had stopped its assault. Howard cautiously raised himself to peek out the front window, then immediately dropped back down, his face ashen. "What?" I demanded. "What did you see?" He swallowed hard before answering. "It's looking right at us through the side window." My heart nearly stopped. Gathering every ounce of courage I possessed, I raised myself just enough to see through the window. What I saw will haunt me until the day I die. Standing there, illuminated by our outdoor lights, was something out of a nightmare. It stood at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair. Its chest was impossibly broad, its arms long and powerful, hanging down past its knees. But it was the face that paralyzed me with terror. Deeply set eyes glowing with intelligence and rage, a wide mouth filled with large, blunt teeth, and a sloped forehead that gave its face an almost primitive human quality. It was looking directly at us, its breath fogging the glass of our window. I dropped back down, pressing my hand against my mouth to stifle a scream. The creature must have seen us, because it let out another deafening roar and slammed into the wall beside the window with such force that the glass cracked but didn't break. "The bedroom," Howard whispered urgently. "We need to get away from these windows." We crawled on our hands and knees to the master bedroom, which was on the lakeside of the house. As we moved, the creature continued its assault, methodically striking different points around the house. We could hear siding being torn away, wood splintering. Each impact made the entire structure shudder. In the bedroom, we huddled in the far corner, as far from any windows as possible. Howard had his arms around me, but I could feel him trembling as badly as I was. The attack continued for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 20 minutes in total. The creature circled our house again and again, roaring, striking the walls, trying to get in, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The final roar seemed more distant, coming from the edge of the forest. We waited, barely breathing, for 10 minutes, then 20, straining to hear any sound of its return, but there was nothing. Eventually, Howard whispered, "I think it's gone." Neither of us slept that night. We sat in the living room with all the lights on, the fireplace poker and a kitchen knife within reach, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house settling. As the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, Howard cautiously looked outside. "Eleanor," he called, his voice strained. "You need to see this." On shaky legs, I joined him at the window. The damage to our house was extensive. Boards were cracked and splintered. Paint was scraped away in long gouges, and most disturbing of all, there were several distinct handprints pressed into the mud near the foundation. Not handprints like yours or mine. These were enormous, easily twice the size of Howard's hand, with opposable thumbs and distinct finger impressions. Leading away from the house were footprints. Massive footprints sunk deep into the soil, indicating the incredible weight of whatever had made them. They headed straight into the forest, where broken branches marked its path of retreat. Howard took several photos with our digital camera, though we've never shown them to anyone. Who would believe us? We spent that morning in shocked silence, trying to process what had happened, what we had seen. By noon, we had packed our belongings. I couldn't stay another night in that house, not with the knowledge that that thing was out there in the woods. We drove straight home, 4 hours without barely speaking, both lost in our own thoughts. We sold the lake house 3 months later. We couldn't bring ourselves to go back, not even to collect the few belongings we'd left behind. The real estate agent called us after the first showing, asking about the damage to the exterior. We made up a story about vandals. It's been almost 20 years now, and I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced I can hear that roar again. Howard and I rarely talk about what happened, but I know he thinks about it too. I've caught him staring into the darkness of our backyard sometimes, tense and watchful. I don't know what attacked us that night. Some would call it a Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but those names seem almost comically inadequate for the creature we encountered. This wasn't some shy forest dweller avoiding human contact. This was something territorial, intelligent, and frighteningly powerful. All I know is that there are things in the wilderness that defy explanation, things that most people go their whole lives without encountering, and I thank God for that every day, because once you've looked into those eyes, once you've felt the primal terror of being hunted by something that shouldn't exist, you're never the same again. I still don't know why it left without breaking in. It certainly could have. Maybe it was just warning us, establishing its territory. Whatever the reason, I'm grateful, but I'll never set foot near those woods again. Some places belong to creatures we can't understand, and Lake Nipissing is one of them. Story: I've been sitting on this experience for over 15 years now, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I've never been one to believe in the paranormal or cryptids or any of that stuff, but what happened to my family during Labor Day weekend in 2008 has left me questioning everything I thought I knew. My name's Jesse. Back then, my wife Victoria and I lived in Florence, Oregon with our 2 kids, our 14-year-old daughter Lily and our 10-year-old son Max. Every year since the kids were little, we'd make the 30-mile trip to our favorite camping spot near Swiss home. It was this beautiful spot by the river, surrounded by dense forest, the perfect place to disconnect from the world for a few days. That year, we were excited to get away. Work had been hectic, the kids were busy with school and activities, and Vic and I desperately needed some time away from the daily grind. We packed up our old Suburban on Saturday morning, loaded the camping gear, and headed out. The first weird thing I noticed was how empty the campground was. It was Labor Day weekend, for crying out loud. This place was usually packed with families barbecuing, kids running around, the whole 9 yards. But when we pulled in around 11 that morning, there were only a couple of RVs way on the other side of the campground. No tents, no families, nothing. "Where is everyone?" Victoria asked, looking around with a confused expression. I shrugged it off. Their loss means we get our favorite spot without fighting for it. We drove down to our usual area by the river, this perfect little clearing about 50 feet from the water, with enough flat ground for our 2 tents and a cooking area. The spot was partially secluded by a ring of tall pines and firs, giving us that private feeling while still being in a designated campground. It took us about an hour to set everything up. The weather was perfect, warm but not hot, with a light breeze coming off the river. After setting up camp, I realized we'd forgotten a few supplies. "Hey Vic, I'm gonna run back into town with Max to grab some extra propane and marshmallows. You and Lily okay here for a couple hours?" Victoria nodded, already settling into her camping chair with a book. "We'll be fine. Lily wants to explore a bit anyway. Take your time." Max and I headed back to Florence, which took about 45 minutes each way. We grabbed what we needed, plus some extra snacks, and headed back to camp. The whole trip took us maybe 2.5 hours total. When we pulled back into our campsite, I immediately knew something was off. Victoria was frantically packing up our cooking supplies, and Lily was sitting in the car, door locked, staring out the window with this look on her face I'd never seen before. "Vic, what's going on?" I asked, killing the engine. The look on my wife's face, I'll never forget it. She wasn't just scared, she looked genuinely shaken. Victoria isn't the type to spook easily. She's the one who checks out strange noises in the middle of the night while I'm still half asleep. "We need to go home," she said flatly. "Now." "What? Why? We just got here." She glanced toward the river, then back at me. "Some weird stuff happened while you were gone. I don't feel comfortable staying." I convinced her to at least tell me what happened before we packed everything up. We sat in our camping chairs while Max went to check on his sister in the car. Victoria took a deep breath and started explaining. Shortly after we left, a park ranger had stopped by and told her they couldn't have a campfire due to a burn ban. Victoria was annoyed. Nobody had mentioned a burn ban when we checked in, but she put it out. Without a fire to tend to, she and Lily decided to go berry picking along the edge of our campsite where some blackberry bushes grew. Lily was being goofy, Victoria explained. She found this big stick and was pretending it was a drumstick, knocking on trees as we walked. Victoria said they were about 10 minutes into berry picking when she heard it. A scream from across the river that made her freeze in place. "Jessie, it wasn't human," she said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "And it wasn't any animal I've ever heard before, not a cougar, not an elk, nothing like that. It was like, I don't know how to describe it, like a woman screaming, but deeper and louder than any person could possibly be. It echoed through the trees." She said Lily heard it too and immediately dropped her stick. They both stood completely still, staring across the river into the dense forest on the other side. The riverbank opposite our campsite was steep, almost a cliff, rising about 30 feet from the water's edge, thick with trees and underbrush. We stood there for maybe 2 minutes, just listening. Then these rocks started hitting the water. "Rocks?" I asked. Victoria nodded. Big ones, like softball-sized. They were splashing down in the middle of the river, one after another. Splash, 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 like they were being dropped from above. She said she immediately looked around for people who might be throwing them, but there was nobody. The other campers were too far away, and the rocks were landing in the middle of the river, at least 30 feet from either bank. Nobody could throw that far from a hidden position in the trees. And the weird thing is, Jessie, they weren't being thrown from the side. It was like they were falling straight down from the sky, but there was nothing above. No cliffs, no bridges, nothing. I felt this cold sensation spread across my back as she talked. I'd always been interested in Bigfoot lore, reading books, watching documentaries, listening to podcasts. Victoria always rolled her eyes when I brought it up. She thought it was nonsense. But what she was describing, the wood-knocking Lily had unknowingly initiated, the inhuman vocalization, the rock-throwing, these were classic Sasquatch behaviors reported by witnesses. Victoria had no idea. She'd never paid attention to any of that stuff. "How many rocks fell?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. 7 or 8 over about 5 minutes. Then it stopped. We grabbed our berries and came back to the campsite immediately. I've just had this horrible feeling ever since, like we're being watched. I glanced around our campsite. The sun was still high in the sky, maybe 4 in the afternoon. We had plenty of daylight left, but Victoria was already packing. With no fire allowed, we can't cook dinner anyway, she reasoned. And I don't want to be here when it gets dark, Jessie. I wanted to tell her about the Bigfoot connection, but I was afraid it would frighten her more. Instead, I just nodded and started helping her pack. Max came back from the car looking confused. "Are we leaving? We just got here," he complained. "Mum's not feeling well," I lied. "We'll come back another weekend." As we packed up our gear, I kept looking across the river, scanning the tree line. The forest on that side was old growth, massive trees with a dense canopy that blocked most of the sunlight from reaching the ground. Perfect habitat for something that didn't want to be seen. I noticed Victoria kept glancing over her shoulder, moving quickly, almost frantically. Lily stayed in the car the whole time, refusing to come out even to help. That wasn't like her at all. Just as we were loading the last of our gear, I heard a crack from across the river, like a large branch breaking. We all froze. Victoria's eyes met mine, wide with fear. "That's what we heard before," she whispered. Then came another sound, a deep, rhythmic thumping that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't loud, but you could feel it more than hear it, like something massive was hitting the ground or a tree. "Get in the car," I said calmly, not wanting to scare the kids more than they already were. As we pulled away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. I swear to God, I saw something move at the edge of the tree line across the river, just a dark shape, massive and upright, slipping between 2 giant firs. It was there and gone so quickly, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. The drive home was silent. Lily stared out the window the whole time. When we finally got home, Victoria seemed to relax a little, but she didn't want to talk about it anymore. Later that night, after the kids went to bed, I finally told her about the Bigfoot connection. To my surprise, she didn't dismiss it outright. "I don't know what it was," she said quietly. "But it wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I know. And those rocks, Jessie, they came from nowhere. I've tried researching similar incidents in that area since then. Turns out there have been quite a few reports of strange encounters around Swiss Home over the years. I found a report from 1976 describing almost the exact same rock-throwing behavior at a campsite less than a mile from where we were. We never went back to that campsite, found a new spot farther south the next year. Victoria refuses to talk about it now, says she doesn't want to remember. Lily was quiet for weeks afterward, but eventually seemed to forget about it, or at least pretend to. But sometimes, when we're driving through heavily wooded areas, I catch her staring into the trees with this intense look on her face, and when I ask her what she's looking for, she just shakes her head and says, "Nothing, Dad, just looking." I still don't know what happened that day. I can't explain the screams or the rocks or the thumping. All I know is that something was out there watching us, something that didn't want us there, and whatever it was smart enough to communicate that message without ever fully revealing itself. And sometimes, on quiet nights when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering, if we had stayed, what would we have seen after dark? Story 16. My aunt and uncle live in this really remote part of Washington, surrounded by dense forest. It's beautiful but isolated, the kind of place where the nearest neighbor is miles away and you can actually see the stars at night without light pollution. They have this gorgeous property with a small clearing around the house and forest, stretching as far as you can see in every direction. I was 16 and spending the summer with them. My parents thought it would be good for me to get away from screens and experience nature. Little did they know what kind of nature experience I'd end up having. It was my 3rd week there. I'd fallen into a comfortable routine, helping with chores during the day, hiking with my cousins, and relaxing in the evenings. I was sleeping in the guest room on the first floor. It had this big window that faced the backyard and the tree line beyond. My aunt and uncle's German Shepherd, Rex, usually slept on the back porch. He was a great dog. Protective but gentle, I felt safe with him around. That night I went to bed around 11 after watching a movie with my cousins. I fell asleep quickly, tired from a day of swimming in the creek. I'm normally a deep sleeper, but something woke me up in the middle of the night. It was Rex. He wasn't just barking, he was going absolutely ballistic. This wasn't his normal bark when a raccoon or deer wandered too close. This was different, frantic, alarmed, almost panicked. I checked my phone. It was just after 3 in the morning. The barking continued, and I could hear Rex running around outside. My heart started racing as I sat up in bed. Something was wrong. Really wrong. I moved to the window, pulled back the curtain, and peeked outside. The yard was dimly lit by this old mercury light my uncle had installed years ago. It cast everything in this weird bluish glow. Rex was running in circles around the perimeter of the house, stopping occasionally to bark toward the tree line. His hackles were raised and he looked terrified. Rex was a big dog, probably 90 pounds, but he looked small and vulnerable out there alone. I was about to go wake my aunt and uncle when I saw it. From around the corner of the house, this figure emerged. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was massive, not just tall, but massive in every dimension. Rex, who I'd always thought was a huge dog, looked like a puppy next to it. The dog barely reached its knees. I froze, my hand still gripping the curtain. The creature was covered in hair, not long and shaggy like I would have expected from Bigfoot stories, but shorter, almost like a summer coat. It was this strange brown silvery color that somehow blended with the shadows. As it moved across the yard, I could see its arms swinging in this weird, exaggerated way that no human would walk. What struck me most was its face. I could see it clearly when it turned toward the light. It looked almost human, not like an ape, not like the monster I would have imagined, but disturbingly human-like. It had a distinct nose and lips, though the skin was the same color as the hair on its body. Its eyes were dark and deep-set, and they seemed intelligent. That's what scared me the most. Rex was going crazy, lunging toward it and then backing away, barking the whole time. But the creature didn't seem bothered at all. It just kept walking, almost casually, like a person strolling through their backyard. It moved with purpose, heading toward the tree line. I was trembling so hard I could barely stand. I wanted to scream, to run to my aunt and uncle's room, but I couldn't move. I just kept watching, hypnotized by the impossibility of what I was seeing. When it reached the edge of the forest, it did something that still gives me chills. There was a branch hanging down, a pretty big one. Without breaking stride, the creature reached up and lifted it, ducking underneath before disappearing into the darkness of the trees. The branch snapped back into place, and just like that, it was gone. Rex continued barking for another 20 minutes before finally settling down. I stayed at the window, scanning the tree line for any movement, but there was nothing. Eventually, I crawled back into bed, but I didn't sleep. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, questioning my sanity. When morning finally came, I was exhausted and jittery. I went to the kitchen where my cousins were already eating breakfast. My aunt was cooking pancakes and my uncle was reading the paper. Everything seemed so normal, like the world hadn't completely tilted on its axis hours before. "You look terrible," my oldest cousin Jake said. "Bad dreams." I hesitated. Would they think I was crazy, making things up? But I had to tell someone. "I saw something last night," I said quietly, outside my window. Jake and my younger cousin Mia looked up from their plates. My aunt turned from the stove. "What do you mean?" Mia asked. "I told them everything. Rex barking, the creature walking across the yard, its human-like face, the way it lifted the branch. As I spoke, I watched their expressions change. I expected disbelief or laughter, but instead, Jake and Mia exchanged this look I couldn't quite interpret. When I finished, there was silence. Then my uncle folded his newspaper. "Let's go take a look," he said simply. We all went outside. Rex was acting normal now, wagging his tail and following us around. We walked to where I'd seen the creature cross the yard. There was a dried mud puddle there from the rain earlier in the week. And in that mud was a footprint. Not just any footprint, it was perfect. 5 toes, an arch, a heel, like a human foot, but massive. I wear a size 7.5 shoe, and this print was easily twice that size. My uncle squatted down next to it, his face unreadable. "That's big," Jake said unnecessarily. Then we walked to the tree line, to the branch I'd seen the creature lift. I had to reach up as high as I could to touch it, and even then, I could barely graze it with my fingertips. The branch was at least 3 feet above my reach. Whatever had lifted it was incredibly tall. "You believe me?" I asked, surprised by their calm reactions. My aunt put her arm around me. "Shannon, we've lived out here for 20 years. There are things in these woods that most people never see." "You've seen it too?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Not exactly like you described," my uncle said, "but we've heard things. Tree knocks, whistles, strange calls at night that don't match any known animal. We found footprints before," Jake added. "Never this clear, though." For the rest of my stay, I was on high alert. Every noise at night made me jump. But strangely, as the days passed, my fear began to transform into something else. Curiosity, maybe even a weird sort of respect. Whatever I'd seen hadn't tried to hurt me or Rex. It had just been passing through, going about its business. We spent a lot of time in the woods after that. My cousins showed me places where they'd found broken branches too high for a human to reach, strange arrangements of sticks that didn't seem natural, and areas where the vegetation had been compressed, like something large had been sleeping there. One evening, as we were hiking back to the house before sunset, we all heard it. A series of knocks, like someone hitting a tree with a stick, followed by a long, low whistle. Jake whistled back, mimicking the sound. There was silence, then 3 more knocks, closer this time. We stood frozen, listening. Then came a sound I'll never forget. A deep, throaty vocalization that started low and rose in pitch before falling again. It wasn't an animal sound, at least not any animal I recognized. It was almost conversational. "They're talking to each other," Mia whispered. We hurried back to the house after that, a mixture of excitement and unease making us walk faster. That night, I lay awake, listening. Around midnight, I heard the vocalizations again, this time from a different direction. It sounded like there were several of them, calling back and forth across the forest. The weird thing is, I wasn't scared anymore. Not really. There was something almost comforting about knowing these creatures were out there, living their lives parallel to ours, but separate, hidden. I never saw it again during my stay, though we heard the knocks and calls almost every evening after that first sighting. When it was time for me to go home, I felt strangely sad, like I was leaving behind a mystery I'd only just begun to understand. It's been almost a year now, and I still think about that night constantly. I've read everything I can find about Sasquatch encounters. Some accounts match what I saw perfectly: the height, the gait, the surprisingly human features. Others describe something more ape-like or aggressive, which doesn't fit with my experience at all. I'm going back this summer. My aunt and uncle have invited me, and I've already said yes. I've got a better camera now, one with night vision. I'm not naive enough to think I'll get definitive proof. If these creatures have managed to stay hidden this long, they're clearly good at avoiding detection, but I want to try. I don't tell many people about what I saw. Most would think I'm making it up, or that I was half asleep and saw a bear or some other animal. But I know what I saw. I know it was real. That night changed how I see the world. There are things out there we don't understand, living alongside us, just beyond the edge of our awareness. I don't feel scared by that thought anymore. If anything, I feel privileged to have had a glimpse behind that veil. If I'm lucky enough to see one again, I won't be frozen in fear at the window. I'll be ready, not to capture or harm it, but just to observe, to learn, to understand a little better, because whatever these creatures are, they've been there all along. We're the visitors in their forest, not the other way around. Story 17. I've been hunting in Florida for over 20 years, but what happened last December in Blackwater River State Forest has kept me up more nights than I care to admit. I'm finally sharing this because I need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar. It was early December 2018, and I decided to challenge myself with a solo hunting trip deeper into the forest than I'd ever ventured before. I'm an experienced hunter and outdoorsman, so the idea of spending 2 nights alone in the wilderness didn't bother me. I'd mapped out a spot about 2 miles from the nearest access road, far enough to reach areas other hunters rarely disturbed. The hike-in was uneventful. It was a cool Florida winter day, maybe 50 degrees, with that crisp smell of pine needles and damp earth. I found a perfect spot between 2 stands of tall pines, with good visibility of a narrow game trail. I built a small brush blind there, nothing fancy, just enough to break up my silhouette. Then I set up my modest camp about 60 yards away. Just a 1-person tent, sleeping bag, and minimal cooking gear. That first night was quiet. Too quiet, actually. Usually you hear all sorts of forest sounds, owls, small creatures rustling in the underbrush, the occasional distant coyote. But there was this weird absence. I didn't think much of it then, but looking back, it's like the forest was holding its breath. I chalked up my uneasiness to being in unfamiliar territory and managed to get some sleep. The next day I spent scouting, found some promising deer sign, and felt good about my chances for the evening hunt. I ate an early dinner back at camp, just some rehydrated stew, and settled into my blind around 4 in the afternoon. The light was starting to get that golden quality it gets before sunset. I'd been sitting motionless for maybe an hour when I first heard it. Footsteps, heavy ones, coming through the palmetto brush maybe 50 yards behind me. What struck me immediately was the spacing. These weren't the quick, light steps of a deer or even the waddle of a black bear. They were deliberate, widely spaced, and they sounded bipedal. My first thought was another hunter, but it didn't move like a person trying to be quiet in the woods. These steps were too confident, too powerful, each one crushing the underbrush with a distinctive weight that made my skin crawl. Then they stopped, complete silence for maybe 2 minutes. I was frozen in my blind, barely breathing, my hand instinctively gripping my rifle. Then, thud! Something hit a tree with enough force that I felt the vibration through the ground. It was followed by what I can only describe as a slapping sound, like something with a massive hand had smacked the trunk of a tree. That's when I heard the breathing. Deep, powerful breaths coming from maybe 30 or 40 feet behind my position. They weren't the quick pants of an animal. They were slow, controlled breaths that sounded almost human, but much, much larger. Each exhale rumbled like it was coming from a massive chest cavity. I could actually hear the air moving in and out of whatever was making that sound. I stayed absolutely still. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain whatever was out there could hear it. For nearly an hour, I just sat there, afraid to move, afraid to even shift my weight. The breathing continued intermittently, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. Like whatever it was circling my position, but staying just out of sight in the dense brush. The sun was setting, and I knew I had to make a decision. I couldn't sit in that blind all night, and I wasn't about to start hiking out through unfamiliar forest in the dark with something stalking me. So I waited for a period when I couldn't hear the breathing, and I carefully, painfully, slowly made my way back to my camp. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I kept my rifle across my lap and my back against a tree. Throughout those long, dark hours, I heard sounds, faint but unmistakable. Brush moving where it shouldn't be moving, that deep breathing now more distant. Occasional thumps that seemed to shake the ground slightly. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted and on edge. I decided to go back to my blind during daylight to retrieve the small pack I'd left there. What I found made my blood run cold. My blind was completely destroyed. Not just knocked over, absolutely demolished. The branches I'd carefully positioned were broken apart, not cut or sawed, but snapped like twigs. The brush was shredded. My small seat pad had been thrown about 15 feet away, but what really shook me were the footprints. There were 5 distinct impressions leading away from the destroyed blind, heading deeper into the forest. Each print was enormous, about 16 inches long with visible toe impressions. They were pressed deep into the damp soil, much deeper than my own boot prints, despite the fact that I'm not a small guy at 230 pounds. I'm not prone to flights of imagination. I've been around enough to know what bear tracks look like. These weren't bear tracks. They weren't human tracks either. At least not from any human I'd ever want to meet. Against my better judgment, I followed the tracks for maybe 30 yards until they disappeared into thicker brush. That's when I heard more branch breaks and a thud that literally shook the ground. I didn't need any more convincing. I went back to camp, packed my gear in record time, and started hiking out. The whole time, I had this overwhelming sensation of being watched. About halfway back to my truck, I started hearing it again, something pacing me in the trees to my left. It was keeping pace with me, but staying just out of sight. Occasionally, I'd hear a branch snap or brush move when there was no wind. The presence stayed with me for over a mile. Then, as I got closer to the road, it faded away. It was like whatever it was didn't want to venture too close to where humans might be. I made it back to my truck around noon, threw my gear in the back, and got the hell out of there. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I've turned this experience over in my mind hundreds of times since then. I've hunted all my life. I know what's supposed to be in those woods. I know what deer sound like, what bears sound like, what wild hogs sound like. This wasn't any of those. The size of those footprints, the strength it would take to destroy my blind like that, the distinctive bipedal movement, the human-like but massive breathing. I can only come to one conclusion, as crazy as it sounds. I think I encountered a Sasquatch in the Florida wilderness. I've never been a believer in cryptids or monsters. I've always scoffed at those Bigfoot shows on TV, but I know what I experienced, and I know what I saw. Those prints were real. That breathing was real. The fear I felt was definitely real. I haven't gone back to that specific area of Blackwater River State Forest, and I don't plan to. I still hunt, but I stay closer to access roads now. And I don't go solo on overnight trips anymore. Sometimes when I'm in the woods, especially as the light starts to fade, I catch myself listening for those heavy, deliberate footsteps, or that deep, chest-rumbling breathing. The most unsettling part is that I've lived in Florida my whole life and spent countless hours in these forests. If something like this exists, how many times has it been watching me when I didn't notice? How many times have I been completely unaware of something massive and intelligent tracking me through the trees? I don't expect everyone to believe my account. Hell, if someone had told me this story a year ago, I'd have thought they were exaggerating or had let their imagination run wild. But I know what I experienced, and I know that there's something in Blackwater River State Forest that shouldn't exist according to science. But it's there all the same. Something that walks on 2 legs, breathes like a human but isn't, and can snap thick branches like they're toothpicks. If you hunt in Florida, especially in the more remote areas, stay alert. Maybe carry a partner and extra ammunition, And if you ever hear those slow, heavy footsteps or that deep breathing that sounds too human but too big to be human, don't stick around to investigate. Trust me on that. I still haven't told many people about this. My hunting buddies would think I've lost my mind. My wife knows something happened that weekend. She saw how shaken I was when I got home, but I've never given her the full details. This is actually the first time I've written it all out. What do you do with an experience that challenges everything you thought you knew about the world? I'm still trying to figure that out. All I know for certain is that something followed me through those woods that night. Something that had no business existing, and I'm not eager to meet it again. Story 18. I still wake up some nights hearing those rocks hitting the cabin walls. It's been 17 years since that trip to Snellgrove Lake, but what happened there follows me around like a shadow. I've never been back, and I never will. It was late September of 2006. Me and 3 of my buddies, Mark, Dave and Chris, had been planning this fishing trip for months. All of us worked office jobs in Toronto, and we needed to disconnect from emails and conference calls. Mark found this place online, a rustic cabin on Snellgrove Lake up in northern Ontario, so remote you could only reach it by float plane. The pictures looked amazing. This little wooden cabin sitting on a rocky rise with dense forest behind it and pristine water in front. No electricity, no cell service, just a propane stove, some lanterns, and whatever we brought with us. The outfitter who owned it promised the lake was full of walleye and northern pike. We were sold. We flew in on a Tuesday morning. The float plane ride itself was an adventure, about 2 hours from the nearest town, flying over endless forests and lakes. When we landed on the water, I remember thinking how isolated we were. The pilot helped us unload our gear and said he'd be back Saturday afternoon. Then he took off, and suddenly the only sounds were the wind through the trees and water lapping against the rocks. The cabin was exactly what we expected, rustic but solid. One main room with 4 bunks, a small kitchen area with the propane stove, a wooden table with benches, and a little sitting area with a couple of chairs. The bathroom was an outhouse about 30 yards behind the cabin. Everything was basic but clean. We spent that first day getting settled, unpacking our food and gear, testing our fishing rods, exploring the immediate area around the cabin. We stored our food in this heavy-duty plastic container with latches that the outfitter had provided, keeping it on the small covered porch. The first 2 days went exactly as planned. We fished, we drank beer, we cooked what we caught, and we played cards until we were too tired to keep our eyes open. It was on the 3rd night that things started to get weird. We'd all gone to bed around 11. I was almost asleep when I heard it, a loud thwack against the cabin wall, like someone had thrown a baseball at it. The whole cabin seemed to vibrate. What the hell was that? Dave sat up in his bunk. We all got up and grabbed our flashlights. Mark took his hunting knife. He was the only one who'd brought anything remotely like a weapon. We went outside and walked around the entire cabin, shining our lights into the woods. But there was nothing. Just darkness beyond the reach of our lights and the sounds of the forest at night. Probably just a branch falling, Chris said, but we all knew branches don't hit with that kind of force. Still, we were tired and wanted to believe there was a simple explanation, so we went back to bed. The next morning we found a rock about the size of my fist near the cabin wall. We looked at each other but didn't say much. Instead, we went fishing like nothing had happened. That 4th night, though, things escalated. We were playing cards when it started, more rocks hitting the cabin, but this time they were hitting the metal roof too. Clang, clang, clang. Then one hit with such force that it cracked the wooden frame around one of the windows. We all froze. Then Dave whispered, "Someone's out there." "There's nobody else on this lake," Mark said. "The outfitter told us we'd be the only ones here this week." I was about to suggest we go out and look again when we heard it, a vocalization from somewhere in the woods behind the cabin. It started low, almost like a moan. and then climbed in pitch until it was almost a howl, but not like any animal I'd ever heard. It lasted maybe 15 seconds, and it made the hair on my arms stand up. What the fuck was that? Chris's voice was shaking. Bear, Dave suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. Bears don't throw rocks, I said. We spent the rest of the night huddled in the cabin listening. The rock throwing stopped, but twice more we heard that vocalization, each time from what seemed like a different position in the woods. None of us slept much. The next morning we went outside to find our food container had been opened. Nothing was torn apart, the latches had been undone, and most of our food was gone. Not scattered around like an animal would do, but taken. Whatever did it had hands and knew how to operate latches. Maybe raccoons, Dave said, but his voice was hollow. Raccoons don't undo latches, and they make a mess, Mark replied. And they sure as hell don't throw rocks or make those sounds we heard. We spent that day fishing, but our hearts weren't in it. We stayed close to the cabin and kept looking over our shoulders. Around 2 in the afternoon, we were out on the water when Chris suddenly pointed to the far shore, about 300 yards away. Look there, he said, in the trees. We all turned and saw it, a large dark shape at the tree line. It was partially obscured by foliage, but it was big, much bigger than a person, and it seemed to be watching us. As soon as we all focused on it, it moved back into the trees and disappeared. That wasn't a bear, Mark said quietly. It was standing upright. We went back to the cabin and spent the rest of the day there. Nobody wanted to say what we were all thinking. That evening, as the sun was setting, it started again. First, vocalizations from 2 different directions, like they were calling to each other. Then the rocks. This time, they hit harder and more frequently. One shattered a window, sending glass across the floor. We huddled in the center of the cabin, away from the walls and windows. We need to leave tomorrow, Dave said. Screw waiting for Saturday. We all agreed. Chris had a satellite phone for emergencies, and we decided this qualified. But the outfitter couldn't come until the next afternoon. Something about wind conditions and having another pickup in the morning. That night was the longest of my life. The rock throwing continued intermittently until about 3 in the morning. The vocalizations too. Sometimes that low to high call, sometimes what sounded like grunts and barks. Once, there was a sound like something heavy walking on the porch, boards creaking under significant weight. None of us slept. We sat in the middle of the room, backs to each other, watching the windows and doors. We had our fishing knives out, for whatever good they might do. Chris woke me with a shake. I hadn't even realized I'd dozed off. It was just getting light outside. I think they're gone, he whispered. I checked my watch, 5:30 in the morning. We waited another hour before venturing outside. That's when we found them, the footprints. There were large, deep impressions in the soft earth near the shore, like something very heavy had stood there. But the clearest print was at the edge of the trees behind the cabin. It was a footprint, unmistakably, but huge, easily 16 inches long with clear toe marks. The stride between this print and the next one visible in the underbrush was over 4 feet. Whatever made those prints was massive. We took photos with our cameras, though the pictures didn't capture the scale or the feeling of standing there looking at evidence of something that shouldn't exist. The float plane couldn't come fast enough. We packed quickly, leaving behind some of our gear in our hurry. When the pilot arrived, he noticed our agitation and the broken window. You boys look like you've seen a ghost, he said. Something was out there, Mark told him. Something big. The pilot gave us a long look. Happens sometimes, he said finally. Some folks have stories about this area. You could have warned us, Dave said angrily. The pilot just shrugged. Most people wouldn't believe it anyway. On the flight back, we compared notes about what we'd experienced. None of us used the word Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but we all knew that's what we were describing. Something large, bipedal, intelligent enough to open latches and capable of throwing rocks with tremendous force. Over the years, I've learned that other groups who visited that same cabin reported similar experiences. One group found clumps of strange hair caught on the rough exterior walls. Another recorded vocalizations like "what we heard." Multiple people have found footprints ranging from 15 to 18 inches. Most disturbing was a report from a group that went the summer after us. They claimed to have actually seen it, an 8 or 9 foot tall creature with dark brown hair and a reddish tint, standing beside the cabin at dusk, watching them through the window. They left immediately, not even waiting for the float plane to return. I don't know what's out there at Snellgrove Lake. I don't know why it throws rocks at the cabin or makes those haunting calls in the night. But I know what I experienced, what I saw, what I heard, and I know that something huge made those footprints, something that wanted us to know it was there, something that was just interested enough to make itself known, but careful enough to stay just out of clear sight. I've never gone back to that cabin. I don't fish much anymore either. Sometimes when I'm alone in my house at night and I hear a strange sound outside, I freeze, half expecting to hear a rock hit my wall or that distinctive vocalization rising from low to high in the darkness. And I wonder if whatever was at Snellgrove Lake is still there, still throwing rocks at that cabin, still leaving its massive footprints along the shore, still letting visitors know they're not alone in the wilderness.